Well, hello everybody. I'm back from America. I think I'm over the jet lag. So it's time for the Patreon Drydock, theoretically, which should have been last week, but last weekend I was in the sky, so let's see how this one goes. However, with the recovery from jet lag, etc., etc., there is a fairly short time span for me to actually record this. So if this has a part 1 in front of it, then you're getting half of it this week and the other half next week. Sorry, that'll just be how it is. If there isn't a part 1 before it, then that means somehow I've managed to fit all of the recording into, a couple of days. So let's see how we go. Nicholas Rassar asks, after your return from your trip, since you've seen multiple ships of the same class, were there any differences between them that surprised you? I wouldn't necessarily say surprised. There obviously are slight differences in the material condition of the different ships because, they've been museum ships for different amounts of time, and in the context of the trip we're talking about basically the Iowas and the South Dakotas because those are the only ones that I saw multiples of. However, in terms of differences between them, I say that not necessarily a surprise, but in terms of, I didn't realise that was going to happen, but a kind of, okay, that's different compared to the last one. I'd certainly say the way that each ship is presented is very different ship to ship, which actually means that it is actually enjoyable to visit all of them. I think it's actually a very good idea because, as I said to some of the people on USS Wisconsin, it was the last Iowa I had seen. I'd already seen New Jersey and Iowa. Obviously, I haven't seen Missouri just yet. And there was a smidgen of concern in the back of my mind going, well, I've already seen 2 Iowa class. Is a third one just going to feel like more of the same? And although some things were very recognisable, there were plenty of other things on the ship that made it a unique experience to visit, and therefore it was just as enjoyable as the first battleship that I got to see, or the first Iowa that I got to see. But as I said, each ship presents things in a very, very different way. And, none of them, I would say, present their ships in a bad way. They're pretty much all presented in a pretty good, very interesting way. But some ships focus more on the technical aspects. Some ships focus more on kind of, this is what the ship would have been like, the lived-in experience, if you like. So you look at some of the cabins, you're like, it looks like someone could literally have just stepped outside and might be coming back. Other differences, some ships looked more at their World War II service. Other ships looked more at their later service, particularly the Gulf War in the case of 1 or 2 ships. And, it's all... I think the thing that surprised me was the fact that there were multiple different ways to present what is effectively the same ship. And that was actually a very good thing, in my opinion. The Rogue Chief asks, visiting 20th century museum ships in the US, I've always noticed there's a unique smell about the ship. I figure this was an effect from the paint, most likely an element used to fight corrosion. But what exactly is it that creates this odour as a side effect? What's the actual purpose, and when did navies begin implementing this? I'm probably not the best person to answer this because, to be perfectly honest, I didn't notice any particularly distinctive museum ship smell. Where there was any kind of distinctive smell to a ship, it tended to be, at least for me, more from the surroundings. Or if it was present on the ship, then it varied from ship to ship. But I think I have an idea what you might be referring to, which I think I've encountered on a couple of museum ships overall. And I mean, unless they are actually, in the process of repainting, which is not too common. They were repainting a Sea King on Yorktown, I think, which, at that point, that they're doing repainting at that on that ship at that point. But internally, I think it's a combination of the fact that obviously they've got to keep aircon running, so anything within the ship is going to be distributed through the ship to a certain degree. And I think it's just, generic preservation materials. So there's going to be, okay, somewhere on the ship there's probably some drying paint. There's going to be grease, both to preserve things and to keep certain elements like bulkhead mechanisms working. There's going to be other forms of cleaning and preservative materials being used inside the ship. There's going to be rubber, obviously electrical components and stuff that will have, in large quantities, cabling and such like, has its own unique smell. Plus, obviously, I've already mentioned cleaning agents, but cleaners and deodorants to obviously try and fight the fact that otherwise a large amount of body odour would build up inside a ship with so many people touring it per day. And all of that kind of is going to mesh together through the aircon system to a sort of a vaguely chemical but slightly organic smell. At least that's what I can tell. Obviously, ships that are more open, in terms of sort of open right down to the base of the engine rooms and stuff, you might also get faint hints of bilge water or whatever coming out, but you shouldn't really be smelling fuel or anything like that unless something's gone horribly wrong. Ryan Frederick asks, at Jutland, you can choose one ship on each side for an MVP award, Most Valued Player. Which ship do you choose on each side? Well, on the German side, that's fairly easy. It's got to be Seydlitz. She took such a pounding, and it's not just a case of, oh yeah, well, she was really durable. She accomplished a reasonable amount in the fight itself, but perhaps the more important thing is, in absorbing that many shells, it meant that as long as she was afloat and taking those hits, those shells weren't being directed at other ships, which may then have suffered worse or perhaps even been sunk. So she's sort of acting as a little bit of a bullet sponge for other elements of the fleet. And considering that she was one of the older battle cruisers present at Jutland, between the durability and the fact that, say, she kept some of probably kept some of her half-sisters and distant relations afloat, it probably deserves an MVP for that. On the British side, whilst it's very tempting to give Warspite the award for similar reasons, I'd actually give it to HMS Iron Duke, Jellicoe's flagship, purely because she seems to have had some of, if not the best, gun crews in either World War. Obviously, she didn't benefit from World War II era fire control equipment and so forth, or fighting, for the most part, at some of the closer ranges that some battleship fights would be fought at. But for the technology that she was equipped with at the time, she displayed absolutely superb gunnery skills. And, even by World War II standards, her percentage of hit versus the number of shells fired would be well in the top 3 in terms of ships for accuracy, even in a Second World War scenario. So between that, the fact that she's carrying Jellicoe and therefore giving the orders that get the Grand Fleet through, and she's just generally a very, very good ship. You can't really ask much more of her, and therefore I'd give her the MVP for the Grand Fleet, at least when we're talking about capital ships. If you get down into destroyers and cruisers, it can be a very different argument, but that's at least the capital ship award. Nick Brodar asks, is there a reason US Navy destroyer gun calibers 5-inch and smaller are odd inches and cruiser caliber guns 6-inch and greater are even inches, or is this just a coincidence? Well, it depends which era you're looking at. If you're looking at, broadly speaking, the World War I period and forward, this is certainly the case. If you're looking further back than that, it's not quite the case, because you have things like US battleships with 13-inch guns, which is, of course, an odd caliber. You have destroyers with 4-inch guns, which is an even caliber, and so on and so forth. I mean, you have cruisers with 5-inch guns, which, again, are an odd caliber. But the reason why your World War I and after US ships seem to follow this rule is that when it comes to destroyers, as I said before, they were built with 4-inch guns, and initially 3-inch guns as well, but destroyer gun caliber was ever on the upward slope, and by the time it came for the US to be building its interwar destroyers, they'd settled on the 5-inch gun for a variety of reasons, one of which was the fact it was a fairly useful dual-purpose weapon, which is something we've covered quite often before. And so they just settled on that. Bearing in mind that the vast majority of the Wickes and Clemson classes were built with 4-inch guns, and then there was a decade-long gap before the Farragut's were built, the next US destroyer class, and by that point they had the 5-inch 38, which was just the standard destroyer gun for the US at that point, from then through to the Gearings. Now, when you talk about cruisers and above, the 6-inch was dictated partly by the fact that, as we've said before, the US didn't really build any cruisers for a good chunk of the run-up to and World War I periods. And when they did start building them again with the Omahas, the 6-inch caliber was kind of the caliber that pretty much everybody was building their latest light cruisers in. So obviously that being, things like the later C's, the D's and the E's in the Royal Navy. The last generations of Imperial German cruisers had 5.9, which near enough is 6-inch, and so forth. And so, 6-inch was the caliber to go for. Then you had the Washington Treaty, which set the upper limit at 8 inches, which then meant that everyone was building at 8 inches. So the fact that it went from 6 to 8 was kind of a coincidence. And then, of course, later on, in the 1930s, the naval treaties made the distinguishment between 8-inch and 6-inch ships. So again, you were left with the even calibers because that's what the treaty said, and no one was going to use a smaller caliber when everyone else was building to the max. And then when you get above the cruisers to the battleships, that's basically just it is a product of the US Navy's decision-making process when it comes to upgunning vessels. So some nations decided that going up in caliber by about 1.5 inches or thereabouts was the way to go. So the British in World War I did that, going from 12 to 13.5 to 15, and then they had design studies for a 16.5. And, I mean, we can kind of ignore the Germans who went from 11 to 12 to 15, but they had their own reasons for that. The French went from 12 to 13.4, which is near enough a 1.5 caliber increase, and they were looking at 15s as well. But then you have other navies, specifically the US and Japanese navies, who decided for their own reasons that actually they prefer increasing caliber by 2 inches. So they went from 12s to 14s to 16s, and of course then the Japanese went on to 18s as well. Now the problem is there aren't that many navies that actually went through a logical series of design progressions that allow you to chart a full escalation in gun caliber and number of guns. Even the Japanese in World War I, there's a fairly big gap. That you have the Kawachis, nothing, unless maybe you want to include the Congos, but they're battle cruisers, so they have different requirements. And then you get the Fusos and the Iseis. The Germans, as I said, they're doing kind of their own thing with the 11 and 12s and then jumping to the 15s in response to everybody else. The Russians only actually get round to building 12-inch ships. The Italians likewise only build 12-inch ships. So in terms of nations that actually have a clear progression, you're basically left with Britain, America, France, and, as I say, technically Germany, if you can deal with their slightly odd way of increasing gun calibers. But the problem is if you ignore Germany and you're left with a sample of 3, then you can make all sorts of arguments about it. But one of the ones that jumps out looking at France, Britain and the USA when it comes to the transition between the dreadnought caliber, i.e. 12-inch, and the super dreadnought caliber, i.e. 13.4, 13.5 or 14-inch, seems, at least on the surface of things to me, to be that if you are the British or the French, if you look at the Corbeil or the Colossus class, they have 10-gun broadsides, and their successors, the Britannias and the Orions, on the super dreadnought side of things, also have 10-gun broadsides. So if you've got the same number of guns on the broadside, then increasing your caliber by 1.5 inches gives you a usefully heavier broadside, which was kind of the rule of thumb that most people were looking at the time. Whereas if you look at the US ships, their last dreadnought has 12 guns as a broadside, and then their first super dreadnought, the New York and Texas, have a 10-gun broadside. So if you're reducing the number of guns on your broadside in order to get a greater caliber of gun, then in order to get your greater throw weight, you actually need a slightly larger caliber per gun. So obviously 12 to 14 inch, so 12 12-inch guns versus 10 14-inch guns, you've still got a slight margin there. Then, of course, the problem is, as I say, you're looking at only 3 nations, only one of which goes the 2-inch jump, and the other 2 are doing kind of the 1.5-inch jump. And then, of course, you run into the issue that the Queen Elizabeths both reduce the number of guns by 2 and only increase by 1.5, whereas logically, if that initial speculation was an absolute rule, then you'd expect either the Queen Elizabeth to have 15.5-inch guns or to have 10 15-inch guns. But on the other hand, it may hold true because one of the first design studies for the Queen Elizabeths was a ship with 10 15-inch guns, i.e. they're, again, keeping the broadside number of guns, just increasing caliber. And they specifically made a decision to go with an 8-gun ship in order to buy speed, which is a slightly different design decision compared to just we're making bigger guns. So who knows, that might be a theoretical idea as to why the US went up in whole digit numbers of inches, whereas other people went up in 1.5s. Andrew Dederer asks, pre-World War II, I noticed there aren't a lot of ships in any navy named for famous naval fights. And in fact, there are a lot more named in one way or another for land battles, though the British examples of all of this seem to trace towards Churchill's first stint at the Admiralty. On the US side, there are plenty of revolutionary battles, but none at sea. Successful ships are just more likely to have their names repeated, Kearsarge being notable. There's even a battle fought by a state before it was a state, San Jacinto. World War II introduced a lot of naval names, mostly in escort carriers. What was the smallest battle to get a Royal Navy ship named for it, with Lexington being the smallest American one at maybe 600 men total? Well, pre-World War I, there were actually and World War II actually, there were a reasonable number of ships that were named after famous naval fights. It just depends on the Navy. I mean, for example, the Royal Navy had an HMS Trafalgar in service barely 5 years after Trafalgar had been fought. They actually had a captured ship, which was captured at the Battle of Camperdown in 1797, named HMS Camperdown, and they've kept the name in service for a good chunk of the intervening time period with successive Camperdowns. So the Royal Navy does have a habit of naming ships after notable victories relatively quickly. The slight paradox to that is that there's obviously HMS St. Vincent, which theoretically is named after the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, which was named so, again, very soon after said battle. But there were also 2 HMS St. Vincents well before there was that battle, so quite what they were named after, who knows. Mind you, they're old enough that perhaps they were actually named for the actual St. Vincent. Back then, the Royal Navy did have that habit. When it comes to the smallest battle that a Royal Navy ship is named after, at least in the period the Channel covers, that's actually a difficult question I don't think I can give a specific answer for, because, well, the Royal Navy has such a long history and has been involved in so many large battles, they don't really end up having to reach for the small ones to name their ships after. I mean, even when you've got something like the battle class destroyers, which is the single biggest continuous run of ships where they're specifically naming them after battles. Well, for a start, a good chunk of them are named after land battles like Agincourt and Alamein, but the ones that are named after sea battles, even the smallest sea battle in the list of the battle class destroyers still involves upwards of 30 or 40 capital ships total when you add together the two sides. So yeah, I don't think it's easy to quantify at that point, because when you talk about small battle, again, because it's ranging over such a large time period, how do you quantify it? Do you quantify it by just number of hulls? Because, there may be, say, something like Matapan. There was an HMS Matapan. That involves, relatively speaking, few ships compared to something like HMS Gabbard, which even though it's a battle that probably virtually no one's ever heard of, because from the Anglo-Dutch Wars, involved well over 200 ships, but the tonnage at Matapan was probably actually significantly greater than the tonnage at Gabbard, because it involved quite a number of large steel battleships, whereas the Anglo-Dutch Wars, you're talking about ships that are mostly displacing well under 1,000 tons apiece. So, and then of course it's a question of if you're doing it by tonnage, are you doing it by numbers, or are you doing it by importance of ship? Because obviously a lot of the Age of Sail battles, if they're between ships of the line, then that translates through to battleships, whereas if it's, say, a large frigate action, it might have the numerical quantity to count as a large battle, but if you translate frigates through into their sort of Age of Steel role, be that whether you class that as a destroyer or small cruiser or whatever, then in terms of ship importance, it goes way down the scale. So, yeah, you'd have to draw up a how are you defining small battle first, and then you'd have to do some really in-depth digging up of various names, and I suspect the smallest battle will be something involving maybe 24 ships of some description in the Age of Sail. But exactly which battle that is, well, that'll take a while, would take a while to find. Trevorius asks, reactions to this video, either in general or anything specific, and this is a video by Greg's Planes, Trains and Automobiles, which talks about what's the best torpedo bomber of World War II. And then the second part of the question is, in the video he talks about better wing folding mechanisms, meaning you can fit more aircraft on a carrier, whereas back in your carrier video you seem to attribute the number of aircraft to the design of the carrier itself. Which is it, and to what extent should the features of their aircraft be included in carrier comparisons? On the one hand, in theory, you can just fly the planes off and put new ones on, but on the other hand, pretending that all aircraft are interchangeable doesn't reflect reality either. So, something I think I mentioned before, but probably needs a little quick restatement. I don't do video reactions generally. I just don't feel comfortable doing it. There are two exceptions. If someone says, oh, what do you think of this video, or reaction to this video in terms of a question for the Drydock? Firstly, if the video is short and awful, i.e., if somebody either clearly has put no effort into it or has absolutely no clue what they're talking about, and it's very easy to point out, you should know better, then, okay, fine, I'll point out how absurdly stupid that is, because, frankly, at that point, even picking up the most basic of textbooks would have taught you better. But this video and that specific channel in question, in general, definitely isn't not in that category. The other time I'll react to or give impressions on a video is if that video is by a channel that I've worked with before, and therefore I know the content creator. In this particular case, I don't. So I don't feel comfortable just, coming in out of left field and giving comments on a video when I don't have the opportunity to pass those on privately to the content creator beforehand. So, which is what I would do. So if you ask me, for example, to say, well, what about this video by the operations room or the shipyard or military aviation history visualized, I've worked with those guys before, I know them, I have their contact details, and if someone said, oh, what do you think of this, then if I had any constructive criticism to make, I then have a channel to reach out to them privately and say, look, someone's asked me this about your video, this is what I'm going to say, this is why I'm going to say it, heads up FYI, okay, cool. As opposed to, say, just, this channel that you've never spoken to before and you don't particularly know, possibly is now talking about your video and kind of hasn't given you a private right to reply, or at least a heads up. So, as a result, unfortunately, I don't feel comfortable giving a public reaction to that specific video in general. However, in the second part of the question, when you talk about the wing folding mechanisms, it's kind of six of one, half a dozen of another. So yes, having better wing folding mechanisms means that you physically can fit more aircraft on a carrier as opposed to fixed wing aircraft, because obviously, let's say you take a Wildcat, which had a fixed wing variant and a folding wing, well, several folding wing variants. If you have folded wing Wildcats, they physically take up less space in your hangar and on deck, so you can get more of them into the same square footage, so therefore you can increase the number of aircraft that's stored on the carrier. This is true. However, the flip side to that is that there is only so much square footage on a carrier, and you kind of tend to at least assume that most carrier-based aircraft have some kind of wing folding mechanism. Now, while it's true that some of them, like the aforementioned early versions of the Wildcat, didn't, the aircraft that are completely fixed wing tend to be the exceptions, not the rule. And they're usually either because there may be some slightly obscure reason as to why they don't have folding wings, but more often than not, although not in the case of the Wildcat, but more often than not, it's because they're just quick hurried conversions. Like, for example, the Sea Hurricane and some early models of Seafire were not folding wing, but that's because they were just adapted land aircraft, not dedicated carrier aircraft. And of course, carriers are generally designed to take dedicated carrier aircraft, which tend to be folding wing in the first place, so you kind of assume that that's the case. And when you do that, yes, having an improved wing folding mechanism might allow you to fit a few more aircraft on the carrier compared to a previous wing folding mechanism, but unless your previous wing folding mechanism was disastrously inefficient, it's not going to massively increase the numbers of aircraft that you can carry. So, if using arbitrary figures, but let's say your aircraft has a wingspan of 50 feet and your wing folding mechanism reduces the overall width of the aircraft to 25 feet, and then you get another, so you can fit, if you fit them bumper to bumper, you can get, or wingtip or wingfold to wingfold, which you wouldn't do, but for the sake of this argument, meaning you can fit two aircraft in the space of one. That's obviously a dramatic increase, but you're kind of assuming that you're going with a Mark 1 wing folder in the first place. If you then get, say, a Mark 2 wing folder and it's closer into the body and your aircraft is now reduced to a 20-foot margin rather than a 25-foot margin, well, yes, in theory you can get more aircraft in there, but you're talking about getting 5 aircraft in the space of 4, not 2 aircraft in the space of 1, which is a much more marginal increase. As opposed to, if you're looking at the actual design of the carrier itself, how big it is, how large the hangar space is, whether or not you're doing deck parking, whether it's an enclosed hangar or an open hangar, and so on and so forth. These design elements that go into the whole carrier, as if you like, that dictates your overall approximate air group in a much, much more definitive way. So, for example, if you look at the Royal Navy armoured carriers, let's say the Illustrious is not including Indomitable because she had a double hangar deck, and the Implacables are slightly different. But the first 3 Illustriouses, so Illustrious, Formidable, and Victorious, they have an approximately 3 dozen strong air group. When they're not using deck parking, you can push it up to maybe just about 50 using deck parking as well. But whether you're using a really, really, really efficient wing folding mechanism on your aircraft, or a relatively standard one, or a not particularly efficient one, your air group numbers are not going to vary too much from that. So having like a bad wing folding mechanism that doesn't save you much space, you might drop down to, say, 28, 30 aircraft or 40 aircraft if you're using deck parking. If you've got a really, really, really efficient wing folding mechanism, you might increase it to 38 or 40 using hangar space only, and maybe go up to 52, 54 using deck parking as well. But you kind of have these central figures that you're not varying too much by. You're definitely not going to end up, just by using wing folding mechanisms, increasing the aircraft carrying capacity of an Illustrious class carrier to match an Essex and have like 70 or 80 aircraft. It's just physically not going to happen. And likewise, unless you, I don't know, maybe unless you use something like fixed wing Avengers or something like that, then you're never going to drop an Essex class's air carrying capacity down to something in the region of a basic model Illustrious class. They've got their standard aircraft carrying capacity, including stuff up in the tops of the hangars, of about 90, and yeah, you might drop it down to 80, might increase it to about 110, something in that region by changing your wing folders, but it's still operating within a relatively narrow margin, which is set by the size and layout and design of the aircraft carrier itself. And then, of course, obviously you have the variations of what air group you're flying, and regardless of whether you're using wing folding or not, if you're flying with a lot of Avengers aboard as opposed to, say, a lot of Hellcats, or a lot of Swordfish aboard as opposed to a bunch of Seafires or Fulmars, then obviously you're going to have fewer aircraft on board because each individual aircraft is larger. But again, the only way you're ever going to get two carrier air groups to match relatively closely when their design gives them a very, very different carrying capacity to start with is if you start playing really funny games, like, say, if you took a bunch of Wildcats with the most efficient wing folding mechanism possible and turned an Illustrious into a pure Wildcat carrying aircraft carrier with hangar and deck parking, and simultaneously invented some form of fixed wing Avenger and decided that your Essex class was only going to carry them in the hangars and was only going to carry Avengers, making it just a torpedo carrier, then you might make things vaguely match up, but say that's really, really stretching plausibility. Christian Slot Hulk asks, on World War II submarines, how were torpedoes aimed? How did they know how much lead to give the target ship, and how did they know if they gave the correct amount of lead? So, generally speaking, you have to solve what's called the torpedo triangle, which is basically a slow-motion variant in 2 dimensions of what you've got to solve when you're shooting a shell at somebody on the surface. So you have to take into account the range to the target and the target's estimated speed. Now, you estimate their speed usually based on periscope observations. So, for example, once you know the range, which again you use the periscope for, then you would watch the ship in your sights, and if, say, the ship progresses through, let's say, 4 markings on your periscope, whatever those markings might happen to be, in a minute, and you know based on the range what distance those markings equate to, and obviously this will be part of your training, then you can say, okay, well, the ship is moving at X number of meters or yards or feet per minute, which translates into a total speed of so many knots, which means that at this range, if we fire a torpedo at it, it's going to take this long for the torpedo to get there, which means at the speed the ship is moving, it'll have moved that far, so we need to fire the torpedo at that point, except now we've created a triangle, so the torpedo is now travelling the hypotenuse of the triangle, which means it's going to be travelling further, so we have to account for that. And there's a couple of iterations of the equation that then will give you, okay, well, taking into account how long it's going to take the torpedo to travel the hypotenuse and how fast the ship is going, they will intersect at this point if we fire the torpedo at this angle. It's a very short version. It's much easier to illustrate with diagrams. It's not the world's hardest set of equations to solve, and in the early part of World War II, most submarine crews would have to solve it manually. Not necessarily entirely by hand with a notepad and pencil. You would have slide rules and other sorts of things that would help with it, but it was basically a manual equation solving exercise with some mechanical assistance. At various points in various navies during the war, subs began to introduce submarine fire control computers. The US, entering the war slightly later than most, had the opportunity to pretty much deploy these to all their more modern subs pretty much from the word go, and that's what you can see here. And this is basically an electromechanical computer that does it for you. Now, you might notice that unlike when you are firing a gun on the surface, I didn't mention your own speed and bearing. Now, that's for two reasons. One, you can set a torpedo to turn to the specific angle once you've launched, so your bearing within limits is not really relevant unless you're pointing in completely the wrong direction or at 90 degrees or something like that. But the reason your speed is not entirely irrelevant but practically irrelevant is that if you are creeping along on your electric motors, your speed is very, very low. It's not zero usually, but it's very low and largely not a factor because you are launching a torpedo at a certain point, and at that point what matters is that triangle, and that then what your sub is doing before and after that launch point is irrelevant. The only way your speed is relevant to your torpedo launch at that stage is at what range is your sub at the time of launch. And this is one of the reasons why the computer comes into relevance, apart from the fact obviously that it can calculate things very precisely. And the other thing is that if you're manually solving the equation, you have to solve it at specific points, and if the sub is constantly moving, that might throw your range estimation out a little bit, or you have to guess what the range is going to be, or you solve for a range that's ahead of you and you have to wait until you hit that range marker. Whereas with the computer, if it's receiving either input from your crew or perhaps direct input from the periscope or maybe later on the sonar, then it can be constantly updating and adjusting, which means that you are able to loose off the torpedo at any point. And in terms of whether or not you've given enough lead, well, that's kind of down to, did you hit with a torpedo or not? And of course the ship may speed up, may slow down, as well as obviously you may not have read the speed exactly right, but that's why, unless you're very, very sure or very close range, you would normally fire a spread of torpedoes. So you'd fire one, say, right, based on how much lead I think, or how much lead the computer thinks we should be giving the ship based on the variables that we've put in, we should fire a torpedo at this angle. But just in case our estimation of the ship's speed and course was slightly off, and therefore the result is slightly out, we're also going to fire maybe another torpedo or two, and one's going to be fired slightly ahead, one's going to be fired slightly behind, and then hopefully one of those three might hit. Paul from Chicago asks, was the Suez Canal deepened during World War II, and if not, how did HMS Howe manage to make the transit? Prior to World War I, could the Invincible and Inflexible battle cruisers use the Suez Canal? And given the strategic limitations on capital ship movement, why was the canal not deepened out earlier? So you might recognise this question as it was asked previously, but I have managed to do a bit more research since then, and the question itself, while similar, has been expanded. And the answer is that whilst the Suez Canal opened at 25 feet deep, which would be really pushing it, considering a King George V has an average 29 to 30 foot draft, as does the Invincible and Inflexible class, so you'd have to do some serious lightning to get them through there. That wasn't the case all the time, because even in the latter part of the 19th century it was appreciated this was too shallow for a large number of cargo carrying vessels. Now, there's a couple of things. One, you can see here as Howe goes through the Suez Canal, she's riding a little bit high, and with the British in control of both ends of the canal, it was entirely possible to take off things like fuel and water and so forth, and just have those available to refill the ship at the other end, which would lighten the ship a little, give them a little more, a little less draft, a little more room to manoeuvre. But the Suez Canal was being continuously upgraded through the latter part of the 19th century and the early 20th century, so I was able to come across, for example, a press release from 1914 which says that the authorised depth of water in the Suez Canal is going to be increased as of that year to 29 feet depth. So by 1914 it was 29 foot, which would mean, okay, yeah, you're pushing your luck a little bit, but a lightly loaded KGV like we see here would be able to transit the canal with a foot or two to spare, maybe even 3 foot to spare. And that's assuming that the deepening efforts stopped in 1914, which, again, as far as I can tell, they didn't. They kept dredging the thing, obviously, but they did also maintain a little bit further depth upgrades. So, yeah, could the invincible and inflexible battlecruisers have used Suez prior to World War I? Well, given the increase in 1914 was by 1 foot, from presumably 28 feet to 29 feet, they have a 30-foot deep load draft, but if they were shallow loaded, then yes, they could just about have used the Suez Canal. And as for how Howe managed it, well, as you can see, by that point, it was a case of, yeah, if she's riding slightly light, she'd be easily able to make the draft as it had accrued by World War II. As for why it wasn't deepened out earlier, well, as I say, the upgrades kind of kept approximate pace with the draft of the biggest capital ships, even if they had to run a little bit light. And again, as I said, with the British in control of both ends of the canal and the fact you're not going to transit a fleet at any great speed, it made sense at that point to go, okay, well, we'll just take some of the fuel and water out, especially once you get to oil-based fuel, and just reload it at the other end, because while the first ship that comes through is reloading its fuel and water, all the other ships will be gradually progressing through. And if you've got someone waiting for you at the other end of the canal, well, you probably shouldn't be using it. Mason asks, if you had to pick one of the surviving US standard type battleships that survived World War II to be saved as a museum ship, which one would it be? Whilst a big part of me does want to argue for one of the New Mexicos, because as you know, they are one of my favourite battleship classes of all time, if we're looking at history, the only argument that could be made against the choice not being USS West Virginia would be it would be nice to have a 14-inch gun ship standard class preserved, at which point default back to my one of the New Mexico's argument. But if you want a 14-inch gunship, we do have USS Texas. And from a historical perspective, in terms of standard class battleships, it's hard to argue that West Virginia shouldn't be the choice because, well, she's a standard class. Yes, she's yet another 16-inch gun battleship. But, she was at Pearl Harbor. She's probably the single most badly damaged ship at Pearl Harbor to actually see service again. So there's that story. There's a story of both her short-term loss and then salvage. And, of course, she's at Surigao Strait, so she has the distinction and would therefore have the distinction of being the only US museum battleship to have sunk another battleship in direct combat, since we weren't able to preserve Washington. And she'd also show, obviously, with the refit, a huge amount of change. You could point out, like, this is part of the original part of the ship, this is part of the refit part of the ship. I think the only other argument other than it'd be nice to have a 14-inch standard that could be levelled for having something other than West Virginia would be that, again, the New Mexicos being a good candidate because they weren't damaged at Pearl Harbor, it might be nice to have something that retains some of the older World War I interwar features, casement guns, etc. So there's a few marginal arguments for keeping one of the older 14-inch standards around, but the vast weight of opinion, I think, would be in retaining West Virginia. Ivor Bachen asks, how closely did the major European navies study the lessons of the Spanish-American War, especially in contrast to how closely they looked at Tsushima 7 years later? What were their design and operational takeaways when it comes to Manila Bay and Santiago? So when it comes to the naval side of the Spanish-American War, there was some study, but not tremendous amount, for a couple of reasons. One of which was that for the big naval powers, like Britain, France, and at that point the upcoming Germany, the scale of the engagements that were involved were seen as quite small. They really didn't have much bearing on how the big navies expected their major battles to go. And obviously something like Tsushima, a full fleet engagement, was much, much more interesting to them in those terms. But some specific lessons that came out of those engagements was, well, one, the hilarious level of inaccuracy on both sides was part of the stimulus towards revamping ships' gunnery. both in terms of being able to fire a little bit quicker and also actually being able to fire accurately at range. And to a certain extent, the reforms both in the US Navy, led by Admiral Sims, and obviously in the British Navy and others, at the very start of the 20th century, that lead to this integration of rangefinders and such like, to extend the range for the first time beyond kind of human eyeball range, have a lot of factors rooted in the Spanish-American War, where it was appreciated, okay, we've got all these guns, but we actually do need to hit at something other than absolute point blank. But broadly speaking, the majority of correspondence and reports from the Spanish-American War that filtered their way back to Europe that were viewed with any great degree of importance were actually the land-based campaign side of things, where, well, let's just say they were not very complimentary about either side. The short version basically being that, well, apart from many other failings, the short version of the evaluation of the land side of the campaign on Cuba was, by any rights and respects, the Americans should have lost, and lost horribly, except for the fact the Spanish didn't even try to oppose them, apart from in sieges, and there weren't even any sallies, so they kind of won by default. At least that was the attitude of a lot of European observers. The other naval thing that was highly commented on wasn't actually anything to do with the fighting, it was more to do with the conveying of the troops, which was regarded by most European naval attaches as a complete and utter shambles, and again something that it was felt was almost giving the Americans the win by default, because it was one of the letters from a naval attaché when remarking on the conveyancing of the troops, apart from the fact it was a completely disorganized mess, and you had a single artillery unit, for example, had its gun carriages in one ship, its artillery crew in another ship, the horse teams in yet another ship, and the actual guns themselves in a fourth ship. So how you were supposed to quickly organise artillery once the ships were landing, who knew? But anyway, he pointed out that the significant contrast between the US Navy escorting the troop convoy, which was actually, keeping station and doing a relatively creditable job of things, and the convoy itself, which was so scattered, so variable and with lights ablaze and everything, that his opinion was if the Spanish had had one decent fast cruiser, they could have just bypassed the relatively sparse US Navy escort and completely annihilated a good chunk of the convoy with very little effort. But the Spanish neither tried, nor, as it turned out, did they particularly have a decent fast light cruiser to try that with. So, again, the troop convoy managed to make it to Cuba without too much incident. John McCarthy asks, many battleship turret designs had working chambers where the ammunition was transferred from one lift system to another for the rest of the trip to the gun's muzzle. However, as far as I know, the US fast battleships had a single lift from the magazines to the gun house. What were the trade-offs between the two approaches, and what led a navy to favour one over the other? So the two main trade-offs were what you might call a burst fire capability and, in theory, a degree of safety. So what I mean by the burst fire capability is if you have a chamber, whatever you want to call it, immediately below the gun level, where the shells and the powder or charges come up from the magazines and then they're transferred and they head on up, you can store a number of charges and projectiles on that level. That is actually perfectly safe because those are stored within, obviously, the barbette. So the barbette has plenty of armor protection. It's part of standard storage procedures for the vast majority of capital ships. Wasn't necessarily always that way, but it certainly came in World War I and people stuck with it. And obviously then if you've only got a single deck's height difference to transfer the shells and the charges through, then you can get those up to the guns very quickly, so you can get a slightly higher rate of fire, because one of the things that dictates your gun's rate of fire is how quickly you can get charges and shells up from the magazines. When you start storing them in the turrets, or when you start overstocking them in the barbettes to the point that they're not in any kind of flash protection, etc., that's when you have problems, but that's a complete different sideline. So that's one advantage of the layout that most other navies used. The other advantage, I say, is in theory a degree of safety, because by having the shells and the charges on two separate lifts and having this break with this different room, then in theory, if something happens in the turret, whether it be a misfire or an enemy shell hit, then flash might carry down into this the first chamber, but then it has to overcome the entry and exit of the first hoist that's going up one level. It then has to overcome the entry protections on the second hoist, any intermediate protections going down the hoist, and the exit protections on the hoist at the bottom, as opposed to with the US system on the fast battleships. In theory, if it overcomes the entry anti-flash protections, then apart from anything that's internal, the flash can proceed all the way down into the magazines, which obviously would be bad. You have to rely a lot on your internal protections at that point, as well as double blind systems at either end, but it's in theory a slight weakness. On the other hand, it means that there aren't any significant amounts of powder or shells stored immediately below the gun, which means that if you do take a hit and there's flash that comes down, obviously in the more traditional systems, then the flash only has to reach one level down before it could potentially set something off. Whereas with the US system, it's got to reach all the way down into the magazines and then overcome both the expansion room that's afforded by the cathedral-like handling areas, and then a couple of extra anti-flash devices, gates and so forth, to get to the actual magazines themselves, at which point even the stuff in the magazines is hopefully mostly within cases, so there's still a fair degree of safety involved, and there's a significant degree of safety on the upper levels involved for the US mechanisms. The other thing with the US mechanisms is they are more complex, because as you can see from here, the powder hoist, which is basically horizontal, has to have this sloping back arc path through the entire system. The shell hoists are vertical, which is therefore slightly less of an issue, but it also means that basically the platform all the way down to the shell handling room has to rotate, because obviously you need to keep your shell hoists in line with the guns, and if the gun turrets rotate, well, the hoists are going to go round, so you've got a lot more complicated moving parts, whereas with the more traditional handling areas, you could have the hoists just vertically up the middle, and therefore much less of your system needs to rotate to accommodate that, and so it's an overall simpler system. But apart from the safety benefits of not having significant numbers of charges stored right beneath your guns, the US system has a number of other advantages. As I said, you've got this very cathedral-like handling area for the powder charges, which makes flash into the magazines from a hit to the turrets almost impossible by most metrics. And by having a single path, you only have a single path of failure, which, that might sound bad, because single path failure, if it does stop working, you're completely stuffed. Okay, that's true. Whereas perhaps in the more traditional layout, if your main hoist stopped working, you'd at least still have maybe half a dozen salvos of shells available in the handling room immediately below the turret. But the flip side to it is that with the traditional hoist system, you have two separate hoists, and if one or the other jams, you're in trouble, especially if the upper hoist jams. Whereas with this system, you don't have two potential points where something can fail. It's either working or it isn't. So a simpler system is less likely to fail in the first place, because obviously, if you've got, obviously the chances of failure are not anywhere near as high, but if you have two sets of things that could fail, then there is a chance that one, the other, or both could fail. Whereas with just one, there's only one set of odds you have to consider for failure. Another thing is it also cuts down on the number of crew that you need, because you don't need this underlying gunhouse crew. You just need the turret crew, and you need the crew in the shell room and the magazines, and that's it. So no intervening step, less crew, less manning requirements, and therefore you can either just flat out reduce your crew requirements, or you can partially reduce your crew requirements and have more crew down in handling the shells and the charges down further down in the ship, which obviously will then make the work a little bit lighter, a bit more efficient. And the other thing that perhaps doesn't normally go appreciated is this kind of system, i.e. the US system, is necessary unless you want to have absurdly tall turrets for something like the US fast battleships, which have very high elevations on their guns as compared to a lot of other warships, both at the time and generally. Because if your gun can elevate to 45 degrees, well, you can see where the pivot point is right behind the front plate of the turret. That means there's a fair bit of gun behind that that's going to go down. And that's going to go down into a gun pit, which now, because it has to be so much deeper, is basically going to occupy the space where you previously would have had a handling area. So you either have the handling area another level down, which is now really stretching things and taking up a lot more space, which you don't want to do, really, or you have a single hoist system, which completely obviates the need for it, which obviously then gives you your much greater loading angles, which is or firing angles at least, which is of benefit. The only other way you'd get around that would be, as I said, if you made the turret significantly taller in order to allow more of the elevation to occur within the turret and less in the gun pit, which might then give you enough space to fit in a handling room. But then the turret's a lot bigger, therefore it's a lot heavier, it's a lot more obvious of a target, and those are all significant disadvantages that you don't really want. And so the American system makes a lot more sense in that case, i.e. especially for guns with higher elevations. Sapper Ninja, not SPR Ninja, apparently, asks, I've heard it said that when the US Navy went from the SoDaks to the Iowas, they traded 15,000 tons for an extra 5 knots. And I've seen some people say, including Norman Friedman, I believe, that this was a bad trade. What is your opinion of this? Other than speed and slight increase in firepower, are there other advantages to the Iowa class over the North Carolinas and the South Dakotas, and are these improvements worth the extra 10 to 15,000 tons? Yeah, and this concern goes actually as far back as the US Navy at the time the Iowas were being designed, because the original design spec, or I suppose invitation for design spec for the Iowas, was literally South Dakota but 33 knots. The whole having a 16-inch 50 armament, which was originally supposed to be the Lexington 16-inch 50s, and then the Bureau of Ordnance screwed that one up, so they ended up having to crash design the Mark 7s instead. But again, another story completely. Came about because the US Navy kind of looked at it and went, not entirely sure the extra expense and displacement is worth having the same ship just faster, so maybe get some extra weapons in there as well. Because the armour scheme, the torpedo defence systems, etc., the secondary armament are all largely the same as the South Dakotas. There's a few minor modifications, but not enough to make a huge difference. Now, as far as whether or not it was worth it with the extra speed, the, as it turns out, slightly improved firepower, and whatever other systems you might manage to get in there, are there other advantages? Well, yes. So the Iowas actually, compared to the North Carolinas, the Iowas have a armor scheme that is at least viable against its own weaponry in certain distances and against other likely weaponry. One of the problems with the North Carolinas, at least on paper, was that they had been designed with 14-inch guns and been armoured against 14-inch guns. And so when they put to sea with, obviously, the somewhat quickly redesigned triple turrets for 16-inch guns, they were in the slightly odd position as compared to the vast majority of warships of not being armoured at meaningful battle ranges against their own guns. As it turned out, it didn't actually make much difference, but they didn't know that going into it. The South Dakotas, of course, were armoured against their own guns, but were very cramped, and they had issues. South Dakota, obviously, famously having all sorts of fun at the first night action of Guadalcanal, but obviously, if you go aboard either Massachusetts or Alabama, both the the staff aboard and the accounts of veterans who served on them will tell you that it was not a fun experience to be on either of those ships when the main guns were getting going, because being so compact, they did suffer considerably more from shock than either the North Carolinas, with exactly the same guns but much more spread out on a larger hull, or indeed the Iowas, which had even more powerful guns, but again spread out over a much larger hull. So in terms of doing damage to yourself and discomforting the crew, the Iowas definitely have an improvement there. They've obviously also just got generally more deck space, so they can fit more light and medium anti-aircraft weaponry as compared to a South Dakota class. So they've got that going for them. And of course, with the additional size and displacement comes a greater ability to absorb improvements. In terms of new radar systems, new weapon systems, etc. And long term, the speed meant that they were kept in service, because the North Carolinas and South Dakotas, one of the reasons that, 3 of them went to scrap and 3 of them went to museums relatively 27 was because they were okay for 1930s battleships speed-wise, but they just 28 knots just didn't cut it in the Cold War environment, it was felt, whereas the 33-knot Iowas did, and so I guess a long-term advantage of their speed was longevity, which is why all 4 of them are around, whereas obviously Indiana, South Dakota, and Washington all went to the breakers. Now, as for whether all of those improvements are worth 10 to 15,000 tons more displacement, it's kind of up to different people to make their different value assessments on. But from my perspective, as you know, I'm a great fan of the Fletcher class destroyers, and the Fletcher class were a larger hull with, theoretically, going by the armament of previous US destroyers, slightly under-spec armament. But this turned out to be a very good thing because it gave them a lot of reserve. They had a lot built into them, which allowed for future efficiency, future use, and made them very efficient boats as well. And so, yeah, again, in theory, you can make an argument that in terms of percentage increase in displacement versus the benefits of the additional speed and firepower purely on paper, perhaps the Iowas are not as firepower dense as a South Dakota or even a North Carolina. This may be true, but in a lot of ways it kind of reminds me of the same thing with the Fletchers. Yes, on paper it's a fact, but in practice it actually gives you so much more room to play with for future expansions of capability, whether that be adding more radar and AA guns in World War II, or later on adding missiles and all sorts of fancy electronic gubbins in the 1980s. So overall I think it's probably just about worth it. Hundertdampf asks, I know from railway engines how destructive a boiler explosion is. How dangerous is a boiler explosion on an armoured warship, and has there ever been a boiler explosion on a warship? There have been quite a few boiler explosions on warships, unfortunately, all through the ages, all the way up to the present day. They are considerably more dangerous than railway engine boiler explosions, and for someone who's familiar with the trains that might seem a little bit far-fetched, but allow me to explain. For one thing, for the majority of the time, the boilers on a ship are going to be operating at much greater pressure than the boilers on a steam train, because they tried high-pressure boilers on steam trains. They didn't really work out, but they are found quite often on ships. Secondly, the boilers on ships are considerably larger most of the time, so there's a lot more steam in them, as well as the steam itself being more energetic. And then also, if you're on a steam engine, and unless it's at a platform in a station, if the boiler explodes, it generally is exploding into open air, and apart from directly behind, most of the fragmentation is going off into open air, so it's relatively unlikely to cause significant casualties. Whereas if a boiler on a ship explodes, well, as you can see from this depiction, you have lots and lots and lots of very, 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 very hot steam, plus lots of fragments of the boiler itself flying out in all sorts of directions, and right in front and around it is the boiler crew. So that's not going to go well, and if it's energetic enough, you've also got the side of the ship to worry about, and it doesn't really matter at that point whether it's an armoured warship or not. By the time you got down to the level where the boilers themselves physically are, on most ships, the armour belt doesn't reach down that far. So especially on earlier ships, which might not have torpedo defence systems and double or triple hulls, a boiler explosion could be absolutely lethal because it could blow out the side of the ship, and then you've got water coming into one of the single largest spaces on the ship, which has probably also just peppered all the bulkheads, and you've got even more access to other parts of the ship. So potentially a boiler explosion could completely total a ship and cause it to sink. In any event, any kind of boiler explosion is going to be a mass casualty event, and pretty much anyone in that boiler room is going to be dead. Some mercifully rather quickly, others will unfortunately linger. If you're in a later ship that has multiple layers on its hull and or torpedo defences, etc., or is just physically larger, then it might not sink you. It might not even breach the hull out to the point where you start flooding, but because obviously you've got the funnel and the air vents where the steam can also escape, but you still have had a major explosion deep in your ship. It's going to have wiped out a significant portion of your power generation capability. You're going to have to be dealing with casualties. You're probably also going to have to be dealing with fire, because obviously the boiler is running with either coal or oil fire to generate the heat. So whilst the steam might put out some of the fires in the immediate vicinity, as the steam dissipates, you're going to have very hot coals and or oil splattered everywhere, which may spontaneously reignite, or it might have been thrown far enough by the explosion that it never gets put out by the steam in the first place. And so yeah, it's pretty much the worst thing that can happen to a ship outside of a magazine explosion. So yeah, incredibly dangerous. And of course, if you're again on one of the smaller earlier ships, that explosion could very well set off the magazines if you're very, very unlucky. It's not a particularly common occurrence, but it's happened enough times that, there's enough of a body of experience that sailors know very, very well that it's not something they ever want to happen to them. A Salty Potato asks, of all the navies that regularly took part in shore bombardment, how did they go about doing it? Did they naturally tend toward the same tactics, or did every nation go about it differently? For example, would one navy like to go about it precisely, whilst another would rather go for flatten the entire Earth approach? A lot of it comes down to resources and time period. Not so much control of the seas, because shore bombardment puts your ships slow and up close to the coast, possibly within range of enemy coastal defences. So usually, unless it's kind of a hit and run thing, you would not do shore bombardment unless you have complete or near complete control of the seas in the vicinity. So that's less of a concern for the most part. But the reason I say it's mostly about resources and time period is that shore bombardment kind of comes and goes. There's not too many periods where multiple nations are all doing shore bombardment, apart from maybe a couple of points in the Age of Sail. But I suppose you have to divide it up into two sections. It's like one is more direct engagement of enemy coast defences, like forts, i.e. frontline defences. Now, in that respect, whether it's the Age of Sail or the early ironclad period or whatever, basically up to the advent of proper rangefinders, it tends to be a case of takes a bunch of ships with a bunch of guns and blaze away with as many rounds as possible, because in theory eventually something will hit, and even the ones that don't hit with enough volume of fire will suppress the defences, so their return fire is not particularly brilliant. That's kind of the short version of that kind of thing. And then once you get rangefinders and dreadnoughts and so on and so forth, it actually shifts, because at the one hand, the ships doing the bombardment are individually far, far more valuable, because, if you get a single ship of the line shot up and you're the French or the British Navy or the Spanish Navy in the Age of Sail, well, it's like, okay, take it back, repair it. We've got like 25 other ones in the vicinity. Who cares, particularly? Whereas if you're talking about dreadnoughts, you might only have a dozen or 24 in your fleet total, and also the effects of enemy fire that is, accurate and sustained tend to be a lot more fatal than, somewhat damaging, which is the general trend for the Age of Sail. So you start to see the people being a lot more careful and also being a lot more selective. So rather than showing up with, a dozen dreadnoughts and blasting away at a fort, they might show up with only one or two, but they'll have carefully pre-selected and pre-planned their fire mission in order to maximise their chances and minimise the chances of the enemy being able to do anything. Usually that leads to either the fort being given up or some rather inconclusive back and forth, where the fort can't really do much to the ship, but maybe the ship is taking a while to do anything much to the fort. The Dardanelles being a slight exception thanks to the minefields, which is something else you have to deal with in the 20th century, as the enemy put minefields offshore. So that's sort of engaging enemy fortifications. And engaging the enemy more generally involves very different types of ships and also almost inverts the tactics, because if you're talking about supporting troops or indirect fire, i.e. not directly engaging an enemy frontline fortification, back in the Age of Sail that would be done by things like bomb vessels, which are specially strengthened ships, usually mounting mortars, occasionally mounting rocket launchers, and later on in the ironclad period, gunboats, maybe the occasional ironclad that was carrying a mortar or similar weapon. And usually, unless it was something like the second attack on Copenhagen or the planned attack on Kronstadt that didn't quite come off because the Russians gave up early enough in the Crimean War, usually these would be, relatively speaking, smaller attacks. So it wouldn't be half a fleet or a fleet, it would be half a dozen to a dozen boats, unless it was a very, very unique major attack. And this is where you're kind of a hybrid of the two, is where you get things like the bombardment of Fort McHenry that gives you the Star-Spangled Banner. But as time goes on, these missions start to involve more and more ships, and heavier and heavier ships. So World War I, for example, the Royal Navy resurrects the Monitor to use to attack point targets on the European coast. And then obviously in the Dardanelles, people start trying general fire suppression with large numbers of, in this mostly pre-dreadnought battleships, the occasional dreadnoughts there as well. And then you get to World War II, and you've got a mixture of cruisers, destroyers, monitors, and as you can see here, battleships, and the sheer volume of fire just goes up and up and up. So whereas for direct engagement of enemy fortified positions that are front line, mostly anti-ship fortifications, things start off with mass numbers and gradually work their way down to pinpoint engagements. When it's more about general fire support, as I said, it kind of works the other way around. It starts off with one to half a dozen ships just doing a generic bombardment, and gradually escalates to heavier and heavier guns and more ships, until you get the sort of the Pacific campaign, where the US is throwing multiple battleships and a bunch of lighter vessels, all just plastering the area with high explosive. In terms of specific nations going about it differently, as I said, outside of something like the Age of Sail, where various ships of the line are kind of, and bomb vessels are kind of doing much of a muchness, in every other circumstance, because shore bombardment usually requires absolute or near absolute control of the local sea environment, it's usually one side or the other doing it, not both, which then tends to mean that it's just the one nation in that particular time period, or if they have allies, like in World War II, they kind of codependently develop shore bombardment ideas, and so you tend to see broad variations on a single theme being used in a specific conflict, and then it kind of all goes away again for a decade or two or four until it comes back, and then by that point the technology's advanced so much they kind of have to redevelop the idea of how to do shore bombardment anyway without too much reference to how it was done before. Schufels asks, what would a typical French troop transport be during the Franco-Prussian War, and how many troops would they typically carry? Unfortunately, there's no such thing as a typical troop transport during the Franco-Prussian War. During the 19th century, to be honest, as with most of the preceding centuries, and as with certain elements of even amphibious landings in World War I, troop transports weren't really a thing that navies kept around all that much. The absolute largest navies, like the Royal Navy, might have a few transports around, but they would only be really enough to move men around for general imperial duties and nowhere near enough to move enough men for any kind of significant, actual active landing attempt in the face of the enemy. The general principle of troop transport in those times was a combination of, well, you might have to maintain a few specialized transports, such as horse transport ships and such like, and say one or two regular transports. But for your broad troop carrying purposes, you would either just enlist the services of your merchant marine, which could be anything, or you might look at using some of your warships en flute, i.e. you take out most of the guns and just use them to move troops around, or if they stay fully armed, you might move slightly fewer troops around in them. Usually you'd use older warships for this for obvious reasons, but as a result, there's no such thing as a typical troop transport, but a troop transport might be a smaller, older warship you've still got all of its guns on it, might be transporting a few hundred men. You might have an older warship that you've stripped most of the armament from, and it might be transporting several hundred people, maybe 100, 200 more than one that kept its guns. You might have a small merchantman that might be transporting 200 to 300 men. You might have enlisted one of your larger merchantmen, and they might be transporting 400 or 500 men, or a bunch of supplies, or a mixture of the two. Or if it's coastal operations, say if you share a land border, so you just have to hop point to point, you might have a bunch of smaller ships that maybe are transporting 50 to 100 men at a time, and everything in between, and all of these things at once. This is kind of the problem when it comes to evaluating these. If you're setting up a specific invasion effort, you might vaguely homogenize along ships of approximately a similar carrying capacity, but each of those ships might be very different. So it might be one very large ship that perhaps has relative to its volume a small amount of cargo carrying space for men, and there might be another ship next to it with a similar number of men on board, but it might be half the size because it might just be a 19th century equivalent of a bulk carrier, and therefore effectively just be a big box. And I mean, even the Royal Navy falls into this category in a fairly significant way, because if you look shortly before the Franco Prussian War to the Crimean War, it's the height of the British Empire, but a good chunk of what they're moving around to Crimea is being moved by P&O steamers and things like that. When the American Civil War breaks out and they're a bit nervous about whether someone's going to go after Canada, whilst Royal Navy transports are running back and forth, the Great Eastern is shanghaied into becoming a gigantic troop transport just to transport large numbers of men relatively quickly and efficiently. So, yeah, unfortunately, there is no straight answer to what a typical troop transport would be, other than that very broad range that I just gave. Paul asks, why did the LVT see only limited use for the landings in Europe? A combination of factors. Firstly, it was the US producing them, so they got to allocate where the majority of them went, and the majority of them were sent to the Pacific. So there just physically weren't as many in the European theatre. And secondly, there weren't as many amphibious landings in Europe. By the time there were enough LVTs built to be seriously considered for use in any particular amphibious landing, the only real amphibious landings left were Torch, where there were a few, but that was very early on in its availability, the Italian landings, and then Normandy, and then follow-up amphibious operations along the European coast as the Allied armies advanced. But when you consider what was the LVT supposed to do, it's supposed to deliver troops and supplies directly to the beaches. Well, in Europe, you could do that just as well with landing craft that had either troops or vehicles in them. And the main advantage that the LVT had in the Pacific theatre, which was that unlike a landing craft, it could climb over sandbars, coral bars, and other shallows that might strand a boat-based landing craft. Well, that usually wasn't a factor off of most of the European beaches. And the other thing that they had, which was obviously they could be later variants, they could be somewhat armoured and armed. Well, in Europe, It probably still wouldn't do them much good against in-place German defences, and there were amphibious tanks available for the purposes, especially with the British, with all those weird and wonderful variants of various amphibious vehicles, and obviously with the DD Sherman as well. So there was less of a need for them as compared to in the Pacific, and so they didn't tend to get used that much. They were still used. They show up in Normandy, they show up in the post-Normandy landings, they show even one or two show up in Italy, but they're in much smaller numbers. And where they do tend to be used in Europe is on things like river crossings, because they can act as generic, useful infantry transports on land. And then it's, we've got to cross the river. Okay, either hop into the LVT or stay on the LVT, and across the water we go, and away we go. Whereas obviously when you're landing on a bunch of tiny little islands in the Pacific, massive river crossings are not so much your concern. But for the most part, it's largely the fact that in Europe you tend to have a big set-piece landing event where you can use a lot of more regular landing craft, and then maybe a few smaller supporting operations, but the majority of the campaign is on land, whereas in the Pacific, the seaborne landing is in and of itself a major part of the campaign, because once you've established proper beachheads and everything, there's usually, unless you're going after the Philippines, but if you're going after somewhere like Saipan or Iwo Jima or Okinawa, there's usually not actually that much left of the island to take. And so in those circumstances, something like the LVT is much more useful, and is going to just see much more use because there's many more operations that need it. Ferrata Victrix asks, what aspect of ship design is, in your opinion, most overlooked by people rating ship designs in each of the eras the channel covers? And why do you think these aspects are important, and why are they overlooked? I would have to say that if I was choosing one, it would be endurance. And by endurance, I do not mean how much fuel you have aboard, how many miles you can sail before you need refueling, etc. By endurance, I mean how long can the ship stay at sea before it needs an overhaul and a refit. Now, in the Age of Sail, that would just be the hull and the sails. Obviously, with steam vessels, that it would be, steam and iron vessels, that would be things like rust. It would be things like how long till your machinery wears out, till you start needing to actually fix it, rather than how long will it last as long as you keep pumping oil or shoveling coal. And I think it gets overlooked because it's very difficult to put a figure to it. With speed, firepower, size, displacement, range, etc., you can put figures to it and say it can sail X distance, the guns have X power, it displaces X tons, and so on and so forth. But with a ship's ability to just endure the sea, it's very difficult to put a figure on that. Apart from anything else, what conditions a ship can endure. In a wooden ship, if it's in the Caribbean, it can endure, in theory, better, because usually the waters are calmer unless you get caught in a hurricane, as opposed to in the North Sea, where it's going to be tossed left, right and centre almost every day. But on the other hand, in warmer waters, you're much more likely to get shipworm, you're much more likely to get rot, whereas in colder waters that may not happen quite as much. So you can only really get a ballpark figure of it, but it is an incredibly important feature of ship's design, and a lot of it goes down to how well the ship is built. And it's important for numerous reasons. One, obviously, it's going to dictate how much money your fleet has to spend on maintaining your ships, because if your ship designs don't have much endurance, you're going to have to be refitting them and etc. quite frequently. Also, your ship's readiness, because let's say if you build 12 ships, all the same, and they have low endurance, you might have 4 or 5 of them being refitted at any one time. So practically, you only have 5 or 6, whereas if they last a very long time at sea, you might only have 2 or 3 in refit at any one time, at which point you actually have, despite the fact you've built exactly the same number of ships as your opponent, you actually have more like 9 or 10 ready to go. And also it means certain missions can be performed by ships with long endurance that other ships can't, and this is one of the major things you see in the Age of Sail, where you might have on a surface level, it's very easy to say, oh yes, well, the British were clearly behind with their ship designs because they were smaller and slightly slower on average than the Franco-Spanish ships, which by inference obviously are longer and larger and faster and slightly more heavily armed. It's like, yes, that's a lovely little surface paper reading, but in practice, the slightly shorter, slightly stubbier construction of the British ships, bearing in mind this is the wooden era we're talking about, meant a couple of things. Well, one, it also meant they were more agile, which was fairly important, but more importantly in terms of endurance, it meant that they could stay at sea for months and months and months at a time without working their timbers loose, which meant they could do blockade duty. French and Spanish ships couldn't. And I've mentioned that before on a number of times on the channel, that captured French 80s, for example, were quite popular with some British admirals as flagships because they were bigger and faster and sleeker and had more space on them than the average British 74, which was fine. The problem was you could have a fleet going out to blockade in the Bay of Biscay, and it might be like half a dozen 74s led by an 80, all fresh out of dockyard, but 3 months into the blockade, the 80 would have to be heading home for a refit because it's worked itself apart so much that there's several feet of water in the hold, whereas the British 74s are quite happily on station and will be there on station probably when that 80 gets back from its refit. So yeah, it's a very, very overlooked element of things, and it carries through into the age of steam and steel, because like I said, with for those two design options where you've both built a dozen ships, it's all very well churning out X number of ships to face off against your opponent, but if your readiness is only 50-60% and your opponent's readiness is 80% because their ships just endure the sea better and don't have to be hauled in for refit and repair all the time, then not only do they have more ships available for the same total build, but because it costs less to run them, they can probably afford to build more of them in the first place. So if we take your less endurance vessels, which are expensive to maintain and upkeep, and you build a dozen of them for the same lifetime expenditure, your opponent can probably not only build 16 instead of 12, but they're probably going to have 13 of them online at any one time, and also all of a sudden you having 5 or 6, they have 13 for the same money. It works out much, much better for the guy who builds a ship that can stand up to the sea for longer. Haunter1 asks, though not warships, ships such as Endurance and Fram are considered to be among the strongest wooden-hulled vessels ever built in terms of structural integrity. Steam engines aside, how did their design and construction methods compare to late Age of Sail warships? There are some basic similarities, like the use of cross-bracing and the use of some iron in their construction, but other than that, they are actually very different outside of the very basic sort of frame and planking ideas. So with Fram and Endurance, actually they have more in common with older Age of Sail ship design, because in older Age of Sail ship design, before the extensive use of cross bracing and iron frames and reinforcement and so forth, ships relied on, for their strength, from being made as much as possible from components that were made from single pieces of timber, single trees. Once cross-bracing and iron framing and etc. got in a big way, well, it was partly in response to the fact that there weren't that many large trees etc. left over to be able to be used, but in addition, it meant that you could use a lot more short timbers, which was for a lot of time what they had left anyway. So with Fram and Endurance, because they were able to make that one vessel in each case, rather than having to mass produce loads and loads of them, they were able to look out for single pieces of massive timber to make specific elements of the ship, which is of course much, much stronger than using multiple smaller pieces joined together. They were also able to go for even more thickness, because of course these ships had to support the weight of supplies and men and protect their crews against the crushing of ice, as opposed to warships, which had to support the weight of supplies and men and all the guns, etc. Plus, of course, you didn't have to pierce the sides of the hull of the Fram or the Endurance for lots of guns, which have obviously structural weak points. And so you could afford to put a lot of the displacement that you would normally put into all of those and multiple gun decks and so forth into fewer decks, therefore less weight, and a thicker hull. Plus, again, because you're producing a single one-off ship design for a specific encounter rather than trying to mass-produce warships, you can go for the strongest, in many cases heaviest timber that you can get your hands on. So it's not just the type of timber in terms of the shape and the scale of it, it's also the specific species of wood that you're using. So they're very, very much artisan bespoke creations, and therefore far, far stronger than late Age of Sail warships in terms of hull strength, with the caveat that obviously they will also include cross-bracing and iron straps and other things that late Age of Sail warships would as well, which would somewhat increase their strength in addition to all the factors we just mentioned. Matt Blom asks, during the early 20th century period covered by the channel, how much of a danger was underwater debris to submarines, and were there any notable losses to rocky outcroppings, shipwrecks, etc. that the sub was blind to? Well, it depends what area you're operating in and what kind of submarine you're in, because obviously different submarines have different maximum safe diving depths. So if you're operating in the mid-Atlantic, well, the seabed isn't really a hazard to you, because if you ever reach it, your submarine has long since imploded. Whereas if you're operating in the North Sea or the English Channel, there is every chance in some of those areas that you might end up actually hitting the seabed before you reach your test depth. Or indeed hitting something that's protruding from the seabed, like a shipwreck or a rock. Now, in terms of how much of a danger this kind of stuff was, a few submarines did go aground for various reasons, either on rocks or on the seabed generally when they misjudged their depth. But in terms of submarines lost specifically because they smashed into something protruding from the seabed, like a rock or a shipwreck, that's somewhat harder to tell, because those kinds of incidents, generally speaking, at least in World War I and World War II, the sub doesn't survive. Or if it does, it's not sunk. It's kind of an either or. Basically, there doesn't seem to be much of a middle ground where a sub hits something deep underwater hard enough for it to cause problems, manages to get to the surface, and then later sinks of the damage. It tends to be either it just brushes past something, and there were quite a number of instances where submarines were damaged by hitting wrecks or rocks, and then just surviving and getting back to port. And then there's the subs that hit something hard enough to breach the pressure hull, and usually the seabed is obviously a fair depth down, and that tends to lead to pretty much almost instant and near enough inevitable death for everybody involved, which in turn means that those subs tend to go down as missing cause unknown, because there wouldn't even necessarily have been an explosion. And quite often you'll probably find that a number of subs which are listed as missing cause unknown or missing possibly hit a mine somewhere, some of those may well have hit something that was just a static object in the water. But without finding each of the wrecks and going to investigate, it's going to be very difficult to tell, especially if whatever was protruding up from below crush depth. So, for example, a rocky outcropping, perhaps in the eastern or western Atlantic or the Caribbean, or a shipwreck that's on an outcrop of some description, or in a slightly higher area where the sub may have hit it, breached, staggered on for a mile or two into a very deep area, then sunk and gone below crush depth. So it's difficult to say specifically if there are any notable losses, but they certainly did happen. Brendan Salisbury asks, I heard Ian of Forgotten Weapons mention that a repeating firearm from the 19th century was dismissed by the Army, but the Navy was very interested for their Marines. Are there any examples of navies leading development of small arms rather than simply using what the Army had? It's not my area of expertise, so I couldn't comment on specific programs or specific weapons, but As I have mentioned before, the requirement for sea service rifles and pistols was often very different to that which the army might want. So quite often, especially in the earlier periods up until the latter part of the 19th century, sea service rifles or muskets, if you go back far enough, would need to be somewhat shorter because of the confined spaces and the rigging and such like that could get in the way. So they could very often constitute a different model. They'd also need to be somewhat more durable because, of course, they're in a saltwater environment. So a lot of the advances in preservation of guns, that's i.e. making sure they need loads and loads of maintenance all the time, quite often came from naval pattern rifles. Generally speaking, where there is any difference, the naval pattern tends to also favour slightly heavier ammunition for longer range and greater stopping power per shot. I'm going to guess that's partly because if you're landing a naval brigade somewhere, there is a fairly finite upper limit to how many people you can have, so you want each individual shot to count a lot more, whereas with an army column of several thousand or several tens of thousands, the fact that you might need 2 shots instead of 1 to absolutely finish someone off probably is less of a concern. Now, quite often that means that naval small arms will be distinctive from the army pattern, but whether they're distinctive enough to be a subvariant of the same or whether they're distinctive enough to count as their own weapon is a completely separate argument. Occasionally, navies would have commissioned and develop a small arm, whether that be a rifle or a pistol, that is different to what the army has issued. But it's very specific cases when that happens, because generally speaking, obviously not all the time, especially in the case of Britain at the height of empire, but generally speaking, the army significantly will outnumber the navy. Therefore, the army is the one that's going to be taking the lead for the most part because they're the one who's going to make the biggest orders. But in cases where naval size of personnel was about the same or at least close to army size, then the navy could start to make their own commissions, and quite often did. And then, of course, you get into other areas where, especially in times of war, when everybody's scrambling to get their hands on as many firearms as possible, World War I being a very, very good example of this, you can end up with the Navy, especially because the Army will just order in massive bulk. The Navy will tend to grab whatever it can, wherever it can, much more so than the Army, because they have somewhat more distinctive divisions. Whereas in the Army, if you've got 16 divisions at the front, you ideally want them all to be armed with the same rifle, whereas for the Navy you could have, the main fleet will have this rifle, but then we're out of this rifle, but we have this other kind of rifle, and maybe that rifle can go on the destroyers, and this third kind of rifle can go on our trawlers and our merchant cruisers, and so on and so forth. And then that means that naval small arms, especially in large wartime conditions, can vary quite a lot more and include a lot of small arms that perhaps the army isn't using. And if 1 or 2 of those turn out to be particularly good, the Navy may then retain them and develop them further post-war on a line that's completely separate from what the Army's doing. The Judge 2017 asks, late in her career, USS Midway was nicknamed the Rock and Roll Carrier thanks to her pitching motion with all the weight of her refits. How was the seakeeping of World War II era refit ships like Fuso, Nagato, Warspite, and the US standards? It varied, but for the most part, since these refits were long planned and quite extensive, the engineers and other designers did actually take into account the fact that the refits would change the ship's overall stability layout, it would change the metacentric height of the ship, which impacts, amongst other things, on how stable it is as a gun platform versus how easily it rolls, and they would account for that with further other modifications, most commonly because obviously a lot of the refits, whether it be to Japanese, British or US ships, were also trying to improve the anti-torpedo defences. So you'd include some form of bulging, because if you were including, more armour on an armoured deck above the waterline, more anti-aircraft systems, more sensors, etc., all stuff that might cause the ship to roll more and be less stable, if you made the beam wider and increase the underwater volume by including some nice big anti-torpedo bulges, you could address that, because then obviously the ship would sit higher in the water compared to how it would sit with all the additions you'd made, which would usually return it to something approximating its designed waterline. And now you've got wider underwater hull profile. That makes you more stable, which offsets the loss of stability from the high weights you've put up top. Whether or not it worked all the time is another matter, and of course how it worked is a separate issue entirely. So for example, a ship that rolls very, very easily is obviously not a particularly good gun platform, but a ship that rolls easily might have fairly defined limits on how far it rolls, and it won't go beyond those. So it might, like you say with Midway, feel like you're on a roller coaster the entire time, but it's actually not going to go much further than that. Whereas a ship that has a huge amount of stability might initially seem to be a very, very good gun platform. Usually ships with wider beams are like this, in that, you know, they're going to kind of ride out most forms of rolling with barely any movement. The problem is that once you get really high seas, once the movement can't be completely resisted and, you know, the ship is actually beginning to roll, that roll tends to be very vicious, which can actually turn what was previously a very stable, very good gun platform into possibly the world's single worst gun platform. Because a ship that rolls all the time but rolls gently can have that roll anticipated for and corrected, whereas a ship that usually doesn't roll very much at all, but when it does do so is very snappy and harsh, it's almost impossible to correct for that kind of roll, which, as I said, in really high sea conditions can actually make a ship impossible to fight. You also got a very wide range of US refits, so the refits done to the New Mexicos or the Colorado herself, as compared to the refit done to something like West Virginia, well, they have very different impacts on the ship's performance in terms of seakeeping. But as a general rule of thumb, if it's a planned full-on modernization like the ships that you mentioned in the question, usually their seakeeping would be as good or better when it came out as from when it went in. Where you tended to have severe issues with seakeeping as a result of refits tended to be cumulative little refits here, there, and everywhere. So, for example, Hood in the late 1930s was actually suffering quite a bit from changes in her metacentric height and stability as a result of numerous cumulative refits, where people hadn't sat down and thought through exactly what the overall impact of all these would be, as opposed to the modernizations where that very much was on the cards. Mikko Leitner asks, is there any research on what kind of effect the real possibility of your shell, bomb or torpedo causing 1,000+ people to lose their lives in a matter of minutes have on naval personnel? And what about the crews of ships witnessing that carnage, like the escorts? So, as I've said with similar questions over the years, psychology isn't really my field of study, so I'm not familiar with any significant body of research into that particular topic or idea. All I have seen is the occasional comment or small study and reflections of various people built up through obviously reading lots of different people's experiences. And you see a very wide gamut of things. I mean, you've got the fact that, you know, at least in the age of steam and steel, i.e. the first half of the 20th century, the people who were shooting the guns couldn't actually see what was going on. If you were in a turret, you loaded and fired the turret, but you had no idea what, if any, effect that shell was having on the enemy, because, well, you couldn't see out of the turret, and even if you had access to the rangefinder within the turret, the target was a very, very small thing. It would only be in exceptional circumstances, sort of very close range battles, something like, and prolonged battles, something like the final battle with Bismarck, where any significant number of the ship's crew would have any idea of what effect their weapons were actually having. And with the same with torpedoes on submarines. You know, you might hear the impact, you might hear the crush of the target as it sinks beneath the waters, but really only the commanding officer and maybe one or two other people who ever look through the periscope can have any idea about what impact that torpedo is actually having. And that's if they bother to check, or can check thereafter. I mean, if they're being immediately depth charged, then even they're going to only be able to go via sounds. Pilots are probably, at least in the early part of the 20th century, about the closest to those who will actually reliably see the effects of their weapons, because, you know, they're flying up close and personal. If they hit with their bomb or their torpedo, they're probably going to see at least the impact happening. But even then, unless it's an immediate detonation thereafter, what they're going to see is, again, relatively impersonal. And I have read a few studies about tank crews, and, you know, people try and train them to think of the tank that they're shooting at as it's a vehicle, you're destroying the vehicle. They try not to get them to think about the people inside the vehicle. And with ships, it's on an even larger scale. It's very, very easy, especially if a ship is obviously buttoned up for action stations, even if you can see it at all, to just see the ship as a vessel. And it's very easy for most people to think, oh yes, well, I need to destroy this vessel, it is a threat. It's only in very specific circumstances, like, as I say, with the final Battle of Bismarck, that you actually get any sense from the people who were on the business end of delivering the destruction that they really appreciated at all in the moment that this thing had people in it. Obviously, once you pick up survivors afterwards, it can become a lot more real, but there's a difference between what happens afterwards and what happens as a direct result of the action itself. And the post-war reactions seem to run the gamut, you know, even from people who were involved in the same action. Some people never want to speak of it again. Other people will speak of it in very guarded terms because they are aware, obviously, it could have been them, and what the human cost is. Other people are somewhat detached and will quite happily go on about what they did and what was sunk and what they hit and what was damaged, either because they've managed to detach the sort of the human cost of things from the physical cost of things in terms of the ships being on fire, etc., or they are just settled with it emotionally. They've come to terms with it and they've decided that they can accept that loss. And you see that, I suspect, across the range. Air Force, Army, Navy, you know, different people deal with things in different ways, and even civilians as well. You know, you look at for example, in the UK, the World War II survivors of the Blitz. Some of them came out of the Blitz with the opinion that, you know, this should never be done to anybody else ever again, regardless of circumstances. Others were completely sort of out for revenge. You know, they did this to us, we must do it 10 times worse to them, and never blinked an eye at it. Others were somewhere on that spectrum, and others were relatively indifferent to what happened to other people afterwards. I know I've met a few people who's, you know, they might be the kindest, nicest people generally. They definitely wouldn't wish direct harm on anybody specifically, but if you ask them about their experiences in the war, and then you ask them, well, what about Cologne, Hamburg, Dresden, etc., their attitude is just kind of, well, what did they expect after London and Coventry and Manchester? You know, it's not brilliant that it happened to them, but they're not going to shed any tears over it either. And, you know, applying that to military personnel, again, you're going to have a few people who are going to be of that ilk as well. Griffin Matoul asks, I'm aware of the ram attack on U-103 by RMS Olympic in 1918, which surprisingly isn't the first time she was involved in a ram, the last time being the accidental and unforeseen one with HMS Hawke. But I was wondering, were there any other instances where a civilian or merchant ship was able to sink, fight, or see off an enemy vessel of some description during their service, and or was there any official civilian or merchant ship that teetered on the line of being a civilian ship or possibly a vessel of war? Well, it depends how far back you want to go. In World War I and World War II, there were a small but there number of merchant vessels which managed to either see off or fatally damage attacking U-boats or armed merchant cruisers / armed merchant raiders with either themselves, i.e. ramming the things or threatening to ram, or using their guns. So that kind of thing did happen, but usually it was a merchant ship going after a U-boat, because the U-boat obviously would then be forced to dive, rather than a merchant ship going after a surface vessel, although, as I said, that did occasionally happen. One particular Liberty ship effectively getting a mutual kill with a German Hilfskreuzer. But The main problem was just the sheer difference in fire control systems, armament, and protection, especially when it came to surface warships, although obviously that didn't stop things like Jervis Bay or Rawalpindi from trying. And to a certain degree succeeding, because although they were lost, their overall objective of protecting the convoys that they were trying to guard was mostly successful. But the further back you go, the closer the line between civilian and warship actually becomes, and thus you could start to see a lot more instances where civilian ships either see off or indeed destroy warships. I mean, technically, HEIC Nemesis was a civilian vessel, and a good chunk of the Chinese vessels that it destroyed were military vessels. It's just the technology difference between the two was so great that for all intents and purposes, Nemesis was a warship, just happened to be in private hands. And then, of course, back in the Age of Sail, you get things like heavily armed East Indiamen, which could, and sometimes did, outgun actual warships or privateers that were coming after them, and were able to either see them off or, in some cases, actually damage them badly enough that they were sunk or captured. Which was a little bit humiliating for the warship captains, because frigates, small frigates at least, would in theory at least have the speed and agility to try and avoid that fate, but didn't always work out for them. And then, of course, you step back even further into, say, the Tudor period and then into the medieval period, where the difference between a warship and merchant ship is basically what's happening that day and who's in command. At which point, arguing, well, does this merchant vessel beat this warship is a very difficult one, because, the next day or the previous day, the role of warship and merchant ship may well have been completely reversed. Trevor Polasek asks, can you briefly discuss how each of the ships present in Battleship Cove in Fall River ended up there? I know Massachusetts was saved from scrapping, but I'm curious about the rest. So, in this picture, which I took just after stepping out of the RV, you can kind of see the other three major ships that are present, or major craft, I should say, that are present alongside Massachusetts, which is obviously taking centre stage there. So, slightly hidden a bit behind the Lionfish is the Hidden Sea, which is a Tarantul-class corvette, obviously Soviet-built, that was in the East German Navy. And then once Germany reunited, as with a number of other examples of East German military equipment, was fairly rapidly transferred over to the US Navy for testing to find out, what its capabilities were. And then later, once they decided they'd done enough testing and budgetary constraints were beginning to squeeze, it was transferred over to being a museum ship, pretty much where it is now. Then you have the USS Lionfish, which is kind of in the foreground, just in front of Hidden Sea, at least from this particular perspective. And Lionfish was a World War II era, just about, Palau-class submarine. And in common with a lot of very late and immediate post-war era US diesel electric subs, she spent a fair amount of time still in active service thereafter. So although she was decommissioned relatively quickly after the war, she was then brought back for training cruises and various other operations, and back and forth into the reserves. And then in the 1970s, the early 1970s to be more precise, she was decommissioned for a final time and, again, pretty sharpish, moved to Battleship Cove to serve as a museum vessel. And then the last one you can see over there on the left is the USS Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., which, believe it or not, despite the Cold War era box superstructure on the back, which, to be perfectly frank, is an aesthetic abomination, as are all box superstructures, but somewhere under there is actually a Gearing-class destroyer. Now, obviously, this is not a Gearing-class destroyer in its World War II configuration. This is a Gearing-class destroyer that's been very heavily modified to serve in the Cold War environment. The box superstructure, for example, being there originally to service the Dash ASW drone, which they thought they might use and turned out to be a fairly abysmal failure. But as with Lionfish, was decommissioned early in the 1970s and brought to Battleship Cove as a museum vessel pretty sharpish soon thereafter. Wayne Borean asks, we've had all sorts of questions about the best and worst ship classes, Please name 5 ship classes from any iron or steel navy that were just average. Ship classes that don't get the big name recognition, but were extremely important to their navies. These can be combat support, auxiliary, or whatever. Okay, well, we can kick off with the Town-class cruisers, not the World War II Town-class cruisers, but the Town-class cruisers of the First World War. You know, the fact that I even have to make that distinction and point out which one I'm talking about kind of says a lot about how relatively little those ships are appreciated. But they form the backbone of the Royal Navy's modern light cruiser, or light armoured cruiser as they're called at the time, force, and therefore the bulk of their fleet screen, etc., during the bulk of the First World War. Now, granted, towards the end you did also start to see C-class cruisers coming in, and they would form a significant portion of the Royal Navy's second-line cruiser strength in World War II, but in terms of front-line, up there and centre cruiser strength, the Town class in its various sub-configurations were hugely important to the Royal Navy in the First World War, but don't really seem to be remembered all that much. From the Italian Navy, I'd say the Trento-class heavy cruisers, they saw huge amounts of service in the First World War, at least as long as Italy was involved, and in, in Trento's case, as long as she was still afloat. But, you know, whenever you talk about Italian heavy cruisers in World War II, everyone's all about the Zara class, and yeah, to be fair, they were fairly important. But Trento and Trieste, her sister, managed to chalk up quite a significant list of achievements, and no one really ever seems to talk about them. If we pop over to Japan, the Miyokos probably actually deserve a good mention, because when you talk about Japanese heavy cruisers, you know, a lot of people talk about the Takao-Atago class, because, you know, the big superstructure, etc., and the fact that they're kind of the last purpose-designed Japanese heavy cruisers. Sometimes people talk about the Toneis because of their, they're heavy cruisers, but they're also kind of scout cruisers at the same time. People talk about the Megamis because of the, the 666 to twin 8 conversions, etc. But, you know, the vast majority of the Japanese heavy cruiser fleet, including the entirety of the Megamis and Takaos, were gone by the end of 1944. To be fair, the Takaos pretty much all stayed around until basically the 1944, whereupon, within a couple of days of each other, they were all either sunk or completely crippled in October, in the run-up to and duration of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. But the Miyokos, despite being the first heavy cruisers that the Japanese built, well, let's say the first full heavy cruiser that the Japanese built, the Albas precede them, but are not up to treaty spec. Okay, the Miyokos are over it, but you know what I mean. And the Miyokos, with the exception of Nachi, which was sunk in November 44, are actually all still around in 1945. So, for a very, very hunted group of ships, they have a significant degree of survivability. Haguro and Ashigara are then sunk. Miyoko herself has been badly damaged and is still in Singapore, so she actually becomes one of very, very few Japanese cruisers to actually survive the war, albeit not in combat-ready condition. Then going back into the Age of Sail, you have the French Océan-class ships of the line, their first rates, 118, 120, 122, 124 gun, depending on exactly what time period you're talking about, but nonetheless, there's a lot of them, including subvariants. You actually have 15 ships of the line, first rates, completed to roughly the same design, which is near enough, as far as I can tell, unprecedented. And a lot of them have a very long lifespan, because although they are just about pre-Napoleonic, and some of them obviously served during that time period and are lost. Commerce de Marseille is captured by the Royal Navy. Océan, the L'Orient, which was formerly Dauphin Royal, blew up at the Battle of the Nile, and so on and so forth. So a few of them are lost, but a number of them survive and more are built. And, for a ship that's originally designed in the 1780s, you have them actually, sticking around long enough to be converted to steam power for a large number of them in the 1840s and 50s. And, okay, granted, they are pretty much training hulks and so forth by this point, but a surprising number of them last into the 1880s, 1890s, and one of them, the Souverain, even lasts into the 20th century before it's scrapped. So very much an underappreciated set of first rates, I think. And then the last one, I'd say escort carriers generally in World War II. They do get overshadowed a fair bit by the big fleet carriers and even the conversions and so forth, but collectively the escort carriers are a huge part of the success story of the Allied navies at sea in World War II. They're convoy escorts, they're fighter platforms, they even combined together to launch some full-on offensive strikes. Obviously there's their role at the Battle of Samar. They're ground support units, they supplement and protect the main fleet. They do all sorts of things, despite the fact that they're basically floating time bombs because of the complete lack of protection they have for their magazines. And they do it fairly well. They do jobs that fleet carriers couldn't do simply because you can't build that many fleet carriers to do all those jobs. Even the Essex class, as numerous as they were, could not have been pumped out in the numbers needed to fulfill all the roles in all the different locations that escort carriers did. And you find escort carriers running everything from operations up in the high Arctic, where aircraft are having to skid down decks covered in ice, all the way into the blazing tropics, where some compartments of the ship can only be inhabited for a few hours at a time, otherwise you're going to die of heat stroke. So, yeah, round out with the escort carriers. Dominic von Bismarck asks, during the mid to late 1800s, naval technology advanced at an incredible pace, but not all technology advanced equally. What technology, other than fire control systems, was solely behind in this era as ironclads got bigger and meaner? Well, you can probably make an argument, to be honest, that gun technology was actually a little bit behind the times when it came to that time period. Now, by that I don't mean that guns began to lag significantly behind armour, but the way that guns were trying to compensate for the increasing thicknesses and technologies involved in armour. Because bear in mind, you went in armour terms from iron to compound to basic steel to hardened steel, Harvey steel, in the mid to late 1800s, with crop steel coming in right there at the end. Engine technology-wise, obviously went from simple engines through various iterations to double expansion to vertical triple expansion and so forth. But when it comes to the guns themselves, you had breech loaders, but other than that, generally speaking, guns just went for bigger to try and destroy the enemy. And it was beginning to get a bit silly, because to break through the armour of the 1880s and early 1890s ships, you needed absurdly huge guns with absurdly long reload times that you could only fit maybe 2 or 3 of on any given reasonable sized battleship. And it was a limitation of a mixture of both gun technology and the propellant technology for the shells as well. And then in the 1890s, that kind of gives where you get better and more efficient, longer burning propellants, and the metallurgy means that guns can also be made longer barrel to take advantage of those improvements in propellants. And so all of a sudden you see everything drop off from 16.25 or 17.7 inch guns, like you can see illustrated here, and suddenly it drops all the way back down to 12-inch guns, calibers which was around in 1870, near the beginning of well, obviously not at the beginning of the ironclad race, that's the 1860, but near the beginning of the ironclad race. And all of a sudden a 12-inch gun, or in some cases even a smaller gun, is as good or better at penetrating enemy armour than something monstrously larger in terms of calibre, because it's longer barrel, it's got better propellant in it, and therefore, because of that and the fact it's obviously the shell's lighter, etc., you can load and fire the thing faster, and you can fit more of them onto ships. So there is a sudden leap, I guess, at that point. But for a good chunk of the main ironclad race, gun technology, apart from, as I said, the innovation of the breech loading, is relatively static. Because, I mean, they had 20-inch guns under development at the end of the American Civil War. So by that standard, the development of the 100-ton gun much later on, although it's more capable than a 20-inch Dahlgren, is not in and of itself a massive leap in technology. Camino John asks, in an earlier Drydock, a member asked about rebalancing the magazines on a battleships. Your answer was provided based on the knowledge you had to hand, and a recent video from USS New Jersey provides the answer, which is yes, that you can. Question, what do you think? Well, yes, I mean, on US fast battleships where you have Broadway, the long passage running fore and aft, and you have the I-beam rail system, then yes, you can rebalance the magazines, relatively speaking, easily. Ask any of the docents or curators on the ships that have super heavy shells or 16-inch shells in the case of North Carolina in their magazines where they had to bring them down Broadway to stock up the magazines, and ask them just what the definition of easy is. It's like, it's easy as compared to having to haul them by hand through the ship. It's still not an easy process. But obviously that depends on the ship having such a system in place. Not all battleships did. And as I said in my previous answer, whilst yes, it may technically be possible, quite why you'd want to do it and when is another matter entirely, because yes, you can rebalance the magazines of a US fast battleship using Broadway, but whether or not you'd risk doing it in combat is another question entirely, or in a situation where you might be called into combat at some point in the immediate future. It exists and it's useful for moving things back and forth, but it would be kind of something that would be done more often than not, either in peacetime or if it is in wartime, when you're very, very far away from any potential threat that, could send something that could penetrate that passageway. So, yeah, I still think rebalancing a ship's magazine in combat is probably not something that you'd want to be doing, even if you technically have the capabilities for it. But it can be done in certain ships with certain equipment. Although, as you can see here, to be honest, I don't see what the big deal is. Seem fairly man-portable to me. The Hand of Ray asks, to what extent do you think Admiral Phillips was personally responsible for the fate of Force Z? Well, as I mentioned in my video on the sinking of Force Z, I think Admiral Phillips does get hard done by most pop history accounts for the most part. Now, did he make mistakes? Yes. Does the ultimate buck rest with him because obviously he is the commanding officer of the formation? Yes. But in terms of personal responsibility, I think probably that's as far as his personal responsibility goes. Again, as I illustrated in the video on the loss of Force Z, a lot of the myths that have grown up about Phillips, that he didn't want air cover, that he didn't believe in air cover, or that he deliberately exposed himself to Japanese air attack, none of those actually have any foundation in reality. Yes, his ships were exposed to Japanese air attack at a range that was 150 miles further than the best intelligence he had available to him aboard the ship said that Japanese torpedo bombers could reach. Did he not have air cover? Yes. Did he not ask for air cover? Yes. But why is that? Because he'd been explicitly told there wasn't any air cover available. It wasn't that he'd just written off and said, no, I don't want fighter cover. He would almost certainly have taken it or asked for it if he'd known that it was there. But he had been flat out told by the authorities back in Singapore that there would be no air cover available. And given that the Royal Navy was very much big on its radio silence, its emissions control, if he's been told that there is no air cover to be had, then why break radio silence and invite potential attack by asking for something that you know you're never going to get? The fact is that there was air cover available, and the communication that had been given to him was very badly worded. But that's something that we can see with hindsight, or that maybe the people back in Singapore should have caught at the sharp end of things. What's he supposed to think if he's told there's no air cover available in the region? And sort of those and other intelligence failures compound into the other things that are often pulled up, like the fact that the radar was on the fritz, the fact that some of the AA ammunition was a bit shot. It's like, yeah, all of these were failures, and all of those did contribute to the losses of Force Z. But if you were in his position at the time with the knowledge that he had, then what you have available to you that influences your decision making is very, very different from what was actually the case, which we know now, but he didn't. To be honest, even the Japanese were somewhat surprised that they managed to pull it off as successfully as they did. So, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, he's the admiral who led the force. He is responsible. He did make a few small tactical errors, which kind of were the final nail in the coffin, as it were. But I don't think the bulk of what's attributed to him when it comes to the loss of Force Z is actually in any way, shape, or form fair, or indeed, in a lot of cases, even true. John Edward Dietz asks, Ekranoplans, they're an interesting thing, and I'm honestly interested in where you classify them, but my question is, have you found any conceptual ideas of similar craft that predate their Cold War introduction? Whilst the wing and ground effect does seem to have been a known thing since about the 1930s, I can't find anything on the Channel side of the 1950 dividing line that indicates that any significant aircraft were proposed or designed to exploit the effect. It seems to have been something that they understood existed from current aircraft and the way they behave when they were near the ground, but research seems to have gone in off and on throughout the next 20 to 30 years before it was finally stabilized in a form where the first wing and ground effect vehicles could be built in the middle of the Cold War. So at least as far as I'm aware, and more aviation-minded enthusiasts may correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think anyone in the 30s and 40s was actually seriously trying to build what we nowadays call a ground effect vehicle. Megascro asks, in the Age of Sail, it wasn't rare for a ship to surrender and to be captured, then used by the enemy, but by World War II, surrender is rare, and there's very little capture and use. When did this stop, and why? Well, there's two elements to that. So, capture and reuse, specifically the reuse element of it, kind of starts to die off in a big way in the 1820s and 1830s, and it's near enough as makes no difference, at least for the larger navies, pretty much gone by the middle of the latter half of the 19th century. And that's because ships are getting more and more diverse. Back in the Age of Sail, everyone understood ropes and sails. The configurations might be slightly different, but it wasn't exactly a massive ask to say, right, well, here's a French ship, a Spanish ship, a German ship, a British ship, an American ship. Can you sail it? Bunch of decent sailors? Yeah, of course we can. It's not exactly rocket science. But when you start to involve steam plants, then each steam plant has different requirements, different maintenance procedures, all the stuff may be in a completely different language. And whilst some early plants might have a degree of easy crossover, as they get more and more complex, things start to need more and more years of training on that specific machinery before you can actually get it to run, at which point you could still, in theory, do so, but one, you've got to source spare parts, which is much, much harder, especially if people are building all the machinery at home as well. Whereas, sourcing spare parts for a sail ship is much, much easier. Plus, it means a completely separate branch of training, completely separate branch of spares and supplies, even if you can get them, which tends to make it rather cost inefficient to run a captured ship in the Age of Steam and Steel, as it does compared to when you're in the Age of Sail. So that's why reuse kind of stops. But in terms of surrender itself, that has more to do with the lethality of combat. When combat is up close and personal between Age of Sail ships, and the to a certain degree, outside of boarding actions, persuading the enemy to surrender is more of an erosive capability. Basically, you just have to wear them down, shoot enough holes in the hull, kill enough or wound enough people, unseat enough guns, dismount enough masts. And usually the ship's structural integrity isn't too badly threatened by the point at which everyone agrees that, actually to continue this further is just going to mean more bloodshed with the same inevitable outcome. Therefore, it's in everyone's best interest to stop the violence and, the party that's been beaten surrenders. Whereas, but as you get into the 20th century, not only are combat ranges much further away, which means there's always more of a temptation of could we escape even if the battle's going badly, and even if a surrender is given, it's going to take a while for the other guy to close in. But also the durability of ships once you get involved armour, and the fact that their propulsion systems have now moved from an easily damageable, easily controllable external propulsion system like a set of sails to an internal propeller system where the engines and boilers are right down in the most heavily protected part of the ship. Well, at that point, as long as you can still maneuver and you can still fire your guns, you're expected to fight, which is kind of the same thing as with the Age of Sail. The difference being that by the time a ship is in a state wherein it can no longer maneuver or fight to any particularly great degree, it's probably been so badly worked over that it is going down anyway, and probably fairly quickly. And it's probably in such a bad state that even if the crew wanted to surrender, there's probably no one alive who can actually get to anywhere where they could make that known. So, yeah, it's just that sort of going from combat capable to completely combat incapable, and therefore no one's going to judge you too harshly by surrendering. That was a point which could be gradually approached and then gradually surpassed in the Age of Sail, whereas in the Age of Steam and Steel, it kind of came, went, and was gone and back in the distance, and then you had to worry about keeping yourself alive in the water much, much, much faster. Lord Nelson asks, Constitution was famously armed with a mixture of 32-pounder carronades and 24-pounder long guns. I know carronades are supposed to be lighter to build and faster firing than comparable long guns, but do you have some details on things like the number of men per gun, shots per minute in battle, and so forth? Well, with a shorter barrel and less weight, therefore having a shorter travel distance in order to reload, being somewhat easier to reload thanks to the short barrel. If you were going to worm and swap it out, it would take less time. There were also cartridges for carronades that didn't need to be swapped out, which would increase your rate of fire. And the fact they're light and therefore easy to get back into position. Yeah, that does give the carronade a faster rate of fire, but of course part of it depends on what weight carronade are you using. Using a 68-pounder or a 32-pounder, a 24-pounder, what? But broadly speaking, whereas with a long gun, i.e. standard naval cannon, you're talking about, if with a well-trained gun crew, about one round every 90 seconds. You can probably get it down to about 60 seconds if you're really rushing, but probably only for a shot or two. So about a round every minute and a half. With a carronade, you could comfortably get off around a minute, maybe a little bit faster if you were really pushing it. The thing is, what you could theoretically do in short bursts, whether for carronades or for cannons, is very different from what you could maintain as a sustained fire rate, not just from the fatigue of the crew, but also from the heating of the gun. Yes, the carronade uses a smaller charge and there's less of it, so there's going to be less heating after each shot as compared to a full-size cannon, but if you try and do a really, really rapid tag team where you're loading and firing a carronade every 20 to 30 seconds, that thing's going to heat up and start cracking or exploding very quickly on you. The other element in terms of gun crew, well, a long gun, assuming we're talking about 24 or 32-pounder long gun, typically needs a crew of 10 to 4, probably more like 12 to 14, 10 you could get away with. I mean, theoretically, you could get away with serving a long gun with a crew of about 6 to 8, but you'd be in very tough straits at that point. Part of the reason why the full gun crew was usually 12, 14 or 16 people, depending on the size of the gun and the navy in question, was partly to absorb casualties, to ensure the gun remained operational even if some of the gun crew were incapacitated, partly to allow them to split so that they could actually operate both sides of the ship's guns if necessary, if the ship was bracketed by two enemies or the captain sailed it between two enemies, and partially obviously to ensure endurance because you can swap people out from the hardest jobs. Now with a carronade, depending on which accounts you believe, your typical carronade crew could be 5 to 8 men, again depending on the size. So a 24-pounder carronade you could probably get away with 5, 68-pounder you might need 6 to 8 men, but you could definitely cut down the number of crew on a carronade by a considerable margin. Tyler Kuhn asks, in the Age of Sail, if a warship ran out of cannonballs during a battle, what substitutes would the crew use to continue the battle if they did not have the ability to flee but still wish to fight? Well, there were a limited number of options. I mean, the first and most obvious one being you could use the other kinds of ammunition on board, so your star shot, grape shot, canister shot, bar shot, etc. But if you're out of any and all preloaded forms of ammunition, well, one might ask, how the heck have you managed to end up in that situation? But there are things you can do. If you're in a situation where your opponent has similar caliber guns to yourself, then you might be able to fish some of the shot that they've sent at you out of bits and pieces of the ship and fire it back at them. Obviously, where you have irritating cases, like a POW using imperial measurements fighting one that's using metric, they may not necessarily agree. So that could be an issue. But, if the opponent's shot is slightly smaller than your own, then a little bit of extra wadding and you might be able to at least have something to fire back, even if it's not going to be the world's most accurate shot. So I guess there's that. If they're extremely close range, well, presumably you've been shot up a fair bit, so in theory you could grab a bunch of splinters from the deck and stuff those in, and then at that point you're down into like proper Pirates of the Caribbean territory where you might consider, again, improvising canister shot with debris and various bits and pieces of stuff you might have lying around. But effectively, once you're out of pre-loaded iron shot, then you're basically down to improvising canister out of whatever you might happen to have on hand and some cloth, or possibly in certain circumstances, I guess you might send the powder monkeys down to grab some ballast stones, but firing any significant number of those is going to be a very hazardous operation to your stability, and probably isn't going to work tremendously well either, because at least with improvised canister you can pack it up to the point that it forms a fairly tight seal, whereas with the ballast stones you'd have to be very lucky to find one that could form something even close to a decent seal with a bit of wadding on a cannon. Admiralty of Floof asks, I remember you elaborating at length in a scenario where armour might have won over gunnery quite some time ago on an old Drydock. You outlined a general ship design that might emerge from that, as it reminded me of the Thunderchild as outlined and drawn by yourself and the artist in a recent 5-minute guide. Is this about right or totally off? Kind of. I mean, I mentioned at the time that you would need a battery of quick-firing guns to try and set fire to the enemy ships, and you might have a couple of big guns to try and punch in at absolute close range, which, to be fair, is kind of what the layout of Thunderchild, as envisaged by myself, actually is. The main differences between Thunderchild, at least in this format, and the ships that I hypothesized would come about in an era where armor beat guns outright, is that in this scenario, in Thunderchild, the armor is still vertical, whereas the armor in any kind of vaguely plausible scenario where armor beats guns would consist of more slope style armor, a bit like a number of Confederate ironclads in the American Civil War. Of course, that only applies for the period up to about 1900, where the gun ranges are pretty short, and sloping your armor at a back angle does actually help to improve deflection, whereas as soon as the ranges open up, it's actually a net negative because it's making it easier for the shell to get in. But if you imagine a kind of in hull form, a kind of a hybrid between this Thunderchild and CSS Virginia, you got some idea of what
what a ship might look like in a period where armour has an ascendancy over guns. Glenn Ricafrente asks, how much of an edge did the 1,000-pound bombs carried by US carrier dive bombers, which were twice as large as their Japanese counterparts, give the US Navy in World War II? I'm guessing they blew away, both figuratively and literally, any pre-war estimates the Japanese had about the survivability of their ships. The 1,000-pound bombs carried by the Dauntlesses do represent quite an edge for a number of reasons. Obviously, the most easy to point out is they carry a lot more explosives, so when they go bang, there is a lot more bang, there's a lot more shrapnel and fire and screaming and all sorts of things like that. So that's definitely a plus. But there are also a number of other pluses, assuming you can get a platform that can deliver the bombs at long enough range and accurately enough to actually hit, which is a very important part of dive bombing. But some of the other advantages, and for this, we do have to turn to the Mediterranean to look at British carrier experiences. And that's not just me being a Brit, this actually has a relevant intersection. So when you had ships like the Illustrious class hit in the Mediterranean by all sorts of bombs, and then obviously later on in the Pacific by kamikazes, lighter bombs, i.e. 250-pounder, 500-pounder, the kind of bombs you might expect to find being lobbed by the Japanese as well, tended, when they hit the armoured flight decks, to just skip off the flight decks, or they detonate and cause basically zero damage. If you hit it with a 2,200-pounder, which the Germans did, then that's a completely different matter. But when you hit it with a 1,000-pounder, which is something the deck is not designed to necessarily withstand, but still affords decent degree of protection against, this is where you see the mechanism that happens. A 500-pounder, it's going to arrive at a certain speed and with a certain amount of kinetic energy and a certain amount of inertia. Now, as soon as it hits something resistive enough to set off its fuse, it's going to start slowing down. And it only has a certain amount of energy, and once that energy is expended, it's going to stop moving. Usually the fuse has gone boom before then, but how far it progresses through the thing that it's hit, if at all, is dictated by, in a large part, by that energy. When the 1,000-pound bombs hit, they're able to get where they get through the armor protection, as opposed to where they just hit outside of it. They're able to get deeper than the 500-pounders, and the 2,200-pounder obviously goes deeper still. And now winding all the way back over to the Pacific, this is where it's quite relevant, because a 500-pound bomb dropped on the average US carrier might, depending on whether it's semi-armor piercing or general purpose, just flat out detonate on the deck, in which case a good chunk of its explosive energy is vented into the atmosphere, and it's not going to do a huge amount of damage. But even going through the wood and sheet steel flight deck of a US carrier, initiating the fuse on a 500 or 550-pounder, it's going to lose a reasonable portion of its kinetic energy, and therefore, since kinetic energy is half mv squared, it's going to have lost a chunk of its velocity, because not a lot of its mass will have disappeared, unless it lost to fins or something. And that means it's slower, which means it's going to then probably detonate somewhere in the hangar, which can be bad, but doesn't immediately threaten the structural integrity of the ship. Armor-piercing bombs, obviously designed, or semi-armor-piercing bombs designed to punch through protection and so forth, usually also having slightly longer fuses, might get deeper, but they're usually unlikely to get too deep into the ship. There are exceptions to this, obviously. The bomb that wiped out part of Yorktown's machinery spaces at Coral Sea. But as a general rule, this is the case. Obviously, bombs have very slightly different performances on a per-bomb basis, depending on how high it's been dropped at, what angle it hits, what exactly it hits, the exact timing on the fuse, and so on and so forth. But anyway, with a 1,000-pound bomb, a 1,000-pound bomb obviously is coming in with a lot more kinetic energy, and therefore when it punches through an equivalent level of protection, it's going to have more of that kinetic energy coming out the other side, which means it's more likely to punch through and the next layer of protection, and it's going to be moving faster, so it's going to probably reach deeper into the ship more reliably before it detonates with its much greater payload anyway. And the deeper it gets into the ship, the more damage it's going to do. And so this is I think probably the other big advantage. It's not just that the individual hits might do more damage for their point location, but a 1,000-pound bomb is much more likely to reach an area where it exploding will do some significant damage, almost regardless of how much explosive is in there, a lot more frequently and a lot more reliably than a 500-pounder will. And of course, if Taiho hadn't succumbed to a torpedo almost as soon as she entered full combat service, you might have also seen the 1,000-pound bombs being able to overcome her deck protection, whereas lighter bombs wouldn't have been able to. Colin Cameron asks, during both World Wars, British fishing trawlers were used for mine clearance. Where did this idea originate from, and was it widespread across other navies? Also, when magnetic mines started being used, were the wooden hulls an advantage or a hindrance, as wood cannot be degaussed? So the idea originated when there was a need to sweep mines, and somebody realised, well, in order to sweep mines, what do we need? We need a ship that's not particularly quick, but should be able to be handleable at slow speeds, and should be able to maintain speed, a consistent speed when it's moving relatively slowly. It needs to have a relatively powerful engine for its size, and needs to be able to haul large amounts of equipment that are attached to it but not on board it. And that pretty much described a fishing trawler. So they're like, well, I guess the fishing trawlers are being made into minesweepers then. And so it was. I mean, they were also very plentiful. A lot of British civilian crew that would now be being called up as part of the Royal Navy Reserve, the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve, or just being called up generally, would understand how to operate a fishing trawler, which obviously always helped. And there were a lot of them. So they kind of fit the bill absolutely perfectly for minesweeping and various other related works. And it wasn't just, fishing trawlers called into service. The Royal Navy actually built quite an extensive number of ships for minesweeping, anti-aircraft picket duty, anti-submarine work and so forth, to lines that were basically trawler spec, which made it them somewhat easier to dispose of post-war as well. So yeah, that's kind of where it came from. As far as whether it was widespread in other nations, well, in order to do so, your nation has to have a relatively large fleet of fishing trawlers to start with. Now, in terms of specifically using fishing trawlers as minesweepers, that did occur. The US Navy did have some. Norway, of course, another big fishing nation, did that a fair bit. Japan did it a little bit. Germany did it a little bit. France did it a reasonable amount. But all of those nations also found other uses for fishing trawlers. As I mentioned with the Royal Navy, they didn't just use them for minesweeping. They had all sorts of other duties. And in other navies, they were used more in those separate duties because, again, small, robust, very able to keep itself at sea, able to haul a large amount of equipment, and pretty handy at low speeds, is a design spec which was very, very useful for all sorts of naval requirements throughout the First and Second World Wars. And to this day, actually, both trawlers and trawler-derived designs are in service with a wide number of different navies. Todd Webb asks, which of the battleships preserved as museum ships in the US was the best, relative to other nations' ships, at the time that it was launched? Well, the answer pretty much has to be the Iowas, because you've got North Carolina, Massachusetts, and Alabama, obviously representing the South Dakota class, but then you have the Iowa class. So when you look at the North Carolinas, they're being built contemporary with the early KGVs and some of the other treaty battleships, Richelieu's, etc. They're competitive, they've got the biggest guns, they don't necessarily have the best armour compared to some of the other ships, but they're alright. Then the South Dakotas, they're coming about at the same time as, well, the Richelieus are actually being finished thanks to their extended build time, the later KGVs, and so forth. So they're still 35,000 ton treaty battleships, obviously trying to fit better protection in. Yes, they don't have quite the same engine issues in terms of vibration as the North Carolinas either, which is good. They've got still the good old 1645 caliber guns, so that's all good. But they are a little bit cramped, a little bit vulnerable to blast damage compared to other ships. And, that they stand near the top of the pack quite comfortably when it comes to treaty ships, but if they're going one-on-one with Bismarck or KGV, or theoretically a Lion, which was under construction, albeit briefly, at the same time that the South Dakotas were under construction, etc., etc., they stand a pretty good chance, but you're not going to put hands down they're going to win all the time, every time. Obviously, you can't necessarily say that in most lineups of vaguely contemporary ships, but then you have the Iowas. The Iowa's got a bit more firepower, same kind of armor protection as the South Dakota. No one, apart from Japan, obviously with the Yamatos, is building anything particularly greater than what they were building when the North Carolinas and the South Dakotas were being built. So sort of everyone else, as I say, apart from Yamato, hasn't advanced their cases much. Obviously, the Lion's being suspended by this point. And the Iowas have that speed as well. So, Richelieu's faster than a South Dakota. She's not as fast as an Iowa. Which, and that's just one illustration. I mean, obviously, the Bismarcks can hold just sheer tonnage over a South Dakota in terms of ability to soak up damage. Well, they can't even do that against a Bismarck. They're also not faster than they can't do that against the Iowa. Sorry, the Bismarck's obviously also not faster than an Iowa. So, yeah, compared to everybody else, the Iowa at the time that it's launched, well, Iowa, Wisconsin, Missouri, and New Jersey, they all stand considerably head and shoulders above anything that's not a Yamato, in a way that the South Dakotas and North Carolinas just about don't compared to their contemporary vessels, which, to be honest, are all pretty much for muchness, all in a similar group. So, yeah, whichever Iowa happens to be your favourite. Goose Riesbos asks, what did the carrier USS Ranger do to become the red-headed stepchild of the US Navy? Basically, she followed her design spec. Fundamentally, the problem with Ranger was that, having completed at great expense the huge Lexington and Saratoga, Congress then decided to try and, well, in the US Navy, I suppose, as well, decided to try and get an aircraft carrier that had the same air group as Lexington and Saratoga on as small a hull as was humanly possible, which they kind of succeeded in. I mean, just a fraction under 15,000 ton standard displacement, Ranger could carry a heck of a lot of aircraft, but that was basically all she could do. When you head into World War II, ignoring Langley, she is the slowest of all the US fleet carriers. Admittedly, she's still able to just about break 29 knots, so she's still faster than Kaga, but she's a little bit slower than the other carriers. But the thing is, in order to buy a respectable speed and her air group, she basically has almost nothing else in her favour. She's the lightest protected of all the US carriers, even more lightly protected than Wasp, and we know what happened to Wasp the minute she took any kind of heavy hits. She's got this slightly awkward arrangement of the machinery, where, as you can see, the machinery is all venting around the aft flight deck. And her air group is smaller than Wasp's theoretical air group. So, as I said, Wasp is put into the Pacific, doesn't last very long because of the compromises made in her protection. And Ranger is basically all of that, but even worse. She's less well protected, she's fractionally slower, she can't manage quite as many aircraft. She's also slightly shorter range, which obviously is very important in the Pacific. So basically, she's the least capable of the fleet carriers and in significant danger of going boom if she takes any hits. And when you look at what's the early US experience of carrier warfare, Lexington and Yorktown are both hit at Coral Sea. Lexington sinks. Yorktown is hit at Midway and sinks. Hornet is battered and eventually sinks during the Guadalcanal campaign. Wasp is blown up, not in battle. Enterprise is hit so many times it's beyond ridiculous. Saratoga is hit multiple times as well. So, every lesson of the early part of World War II as far as the Americans are involved, and most of the lessons of the Mediterranean, which obviously the US is taking on board from the Royal Navy, are that carriers are going to get hit if you put them in frontline combat environments, and they know for a fact that Ranger cannot afford to get hit, and thus she ends up being put into environments where she's somewhat less likely to be hit. I mean, she's very, very useful in those environments because she is a small compact carrier that can loft an awful lot of aircraft. So don't get me wrong, she's not a useless carrier. She's just not as survivable as all the other US fleet carriers, and thus isn't put into situations where that might be called into practicality. Fluffy Goat asks, on the early carriers, like the Kaga that had multiple flight decks, how bad were working conditions on those hangars when a good 20-knot headwind was coming straight into the hangar, as opposed to ships like Lexington where the hangar was pretty well protected from the elements? Was anything done on those carriers to mitigate the effects of the wind blowing into the hangar? It strikes me that normal maintenance would be very difficult with such a breeze. Yeah, well, that and a lot of sea spray as well. But yeah, there were measures taken to break up wind flow and to deal with the effects generally. So you can see here, this is Kaga in her multi-flight deck configuration mode. And if you look on the second flight deck, you can see there's the engines of a couple of aircraft, either in storage or possibly waiting to take off. But you can see behind, which is something you can't necessarily see on the lowest flight deck because, well, A, there's some washing in the way, and B, there's a big shadowed area. But you can see that there are actually, on the middle flight deck, a set of roller doors that have been brought down. So this is basically the ultimate way of making sure that you're not in an eternal wind tunnel when you have these multi-flight deck level carriers. So the aircraft go out onto the takeoff portion of the flight deck, and then if the wind is bad, or the wind effects are bad, then you close, or partly close, depending on what's necessary, these doors, and then you're fine. The wind hopefully is just going to batter on those and not head into the hangar any further. So to be clear, obviously, with these flight decks, the aircraft aren't starting their run-up substantially within the hangar and then running out onto these flying off platforms and then away. They are basically starting out in the open, perhaps very, very marginally undercover, but not all that much. And that's the main reason why they're removed. If the aircraft were starting the takeoff run maybe a third of the way down the length of the ship, running out through an open door and out onto the takeoff platform and away, then, to be honest, the multi-level platform and some carriers probably would have hung around a lot longer than they did. Part of the fundamental problem, however, was that flight ops took place outside the hangar, and obviously then there's significantly less space available, which vastly limits aircraft operations. So, in the short version, in order to not have an eternal wind tunnel, is you just close the front door. Randy Dandy O says, in your opinion, was Admiral Somerville's plan for combat in the Indian Ocean during 1942 a realistic combat strategy, or a bit mad? If Force A had been able to maintain contact with the Japanese during the Indian Ocean raid, what would you rate its chances of success at? So, this is an answer that has two separate parts. So, based on the intelligence he was given, well, there's that phrase again, with relation to British forces in the Pacific Theatre. So based on the intelligence he was given, which was that the Japanese had a pair of carriers and standard escorts for them in the Indian Ocean, Somerville's plan, which, as you summarise, basically play keep away during the day and close in and use albacores with ASV radar and then follow up with a surface attack at night, was perfectly workable. It had worked fine against the Italians when the Italians had far greater numbers, and Somerville had 2 carriers and Warspite along with a couple of cruisers and some destroyers as escort. He did have the 4R class tooling along a little bit further behind if they really, really were needed. But, against the forces that he had been told the Japanese had, he actually had a technical superiority in everything other than aircraft. So as long as he could keep those aircraft away from him during the day by staying at a distance or staying undetected and then closing in at night, well, then he has radar, he has capital ships, where his opponent apparently doesn't. He has night-capable attack aircraft. His opponent definitely doesn't have those. He should win out fairly well. So it's a realistic combat strategy. And indeed, it almost worked. Got stacks of information out of the archives from deck logs, combat logs, etc. You wouldn't believe how close Somerville came to being able to wipe out a significant portion of the Kido Butai Matapan style. It's something I'll have to do when I do a video on Operation C, just looking at, what happened and what could and almost did happen, but for a stray 20mm round or so. Nonetheless, the flip side of that equation is that, of course, Somerville's intelligence was not accurate. What Somerville thought was 2 carriers was actually 4, and what he thought was regular escorts was actually capital ship escorts, and a number of them. So, yeah. Against the forces that were actually present in the Indian Ocean, Somerville's strategy was playing very, 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 very high risk for, well, as it turned out, possible, actually, quite a lot of reward, but only thanks to the way the Japanese were manoeuvring. But yeah, I think if Somerville had actually known what exactly constituted the Japanese side of the Indian Ocean raid, he would not have tried the strategy that he was trying, no matter how aggressive he wanted to be. But he didn't. And so, yeah, he played a strategy that was workable against the forces he'd been told he was facing. And that's all you can really ask someone to do. You can't ask them to second-guess your intel officers and assume that an enemy force 3 times as strong as what you've been told is actually out there, especially when your scout aircraft keep getting shot down during the day. Now, as far as if Force A had been able to maintain contact with the Japanese and bring them to battle, well, that's something that I will explore when I do a video on Operation C. I've thought it out myself. I've wargamed it out with Dr. Clark and a few others. As with all war games, there are fairly wide extremes that can result from everything from the entire Kido Butai sunk at one extremely unlikely extreme to the entire British force sunk at the other extreme. But minor spoiler alert, the median outcome appears to be something along the lines of the Japanese do actually lose a pair of carriers. That's near enough certain. The uncertainty and where all the predictions, etc., come in is what happens after that. You can have scenarios where nothing further happens. You can have scenarios where the British lose their force, both subsequently in the night and in the following day. You can have a situation where the Japanese lose some more of their forces and then withdraw, and all sorts of other outcomes. But, that's something for a much, much wider scope video. Fireteam Joker asks, if you were an American merchantman before 1812, how likely was it for a British warship to pull up next to your merchant ship and say, congratulations, you're now all British sailors? Were the British so hard up for sailors that they had to resort to slavery? Well, it's not actually slavery. I mean, yes, it's involuntary servitude, but you are at least getting paid. So, to quote the great Jeff Goldblum, you were quite literally a prisoner with a job, but never mind. Anyway, the general point, impressment, i.e. forcible conscription into Royal Navy service, it became more and more of an issue as time went on, as the Napoleonic Wars increased in pitch and fervour, although ironically enough, by the time that the War of 1812 kicked off, it was actually dying off, because by that point the majority of the French Navy was bottled up in port, and the Royal Navy wasn't quite as desperate for sailors as it had been in the earlier part of the 19th century. But you had this weird progression where you had obviously the quasi-war with France, between the US and France, at which point the Royal Navy was quite happy to leave the Americans to annoy the French, because that's kind of what the British were doing anyway, but since the Americans were doing it themselves, we'll let them get on with it. Then you had kind of the mid 1800 part of the 1800s, which is where, in the immediate aftermath of Trafalgar, naval campaigns are still ongoing. The British desperately need sailors. There's a reasonable amount of impressment, and then you get it gradually tailing off in the early 1810s, but by that point the US has had enough, and there's a lot of other issues that go into the War of 1812.
Nevertheless, even then, they wouldn't make the entire ship's crew merchant sailors. They didn't even do that, for the most part, to British merchant ships, because it was appreciated, this ship has to get from point A to point B, therefore it has a certain minimum manning requirement for it to be able to safely do that, because if you take all the sailors off, well, what you can do, you can end up having to pay restitution to the people who own the cargo that was just lost, the people who own the ship that was just lost, or you're going to have to tow the ship with you, which is kind of counterproductive to you getting on with what you actually want to do, because you can't take it as a prize, because it's not a hostile power usually transporting contraband. So you take off a few sailors, but not everyone. And also, in terms of likelihood, a lot of it depended on the captain. So officially, obviously, the US was independent, and yes, the British Empire officially recognised America as independent. There were a few Royal Navy captains who still thought of the Americans as slightly rebellious British people and kind of didn't recognise it. That was kind of on their own head. But then there was also a fairly large grey area. And so, for example, the Chesapeake Leopard affair, which is seen in this picture, kind of exemplifies that. So the big grey area of impressment off of US ships was who exactly was a US citizen. As far as the British were concerned, there were two groups of people that they were especially interested in getting off of American ships, when you didn't have the occasional captain who thought that the Americans were kind of like a strategic British personnel reserve in the way that the French Navy was a strategic British ship reserve. But when you had captains who were more willing to abide by the letter of the law, you had British people who had emigrated to the United States relatively recently, and who might be thought of as British citizens who just happened to have temporarily moved overseas. Maybe they intend it to be permanent, but you know what, they're still British citizens. They spent the majority of their life in Britain, and so they owe the Crown allegiance and service, and so therefore they're coming off of that ship and onto our ship. In some ways, ironically, similar to how, as far as I understand it, the IRS in the US will continue taxing you as an American, even if you live in a completely different country, and even if you've lived in a completely different country for possibly even decades, because, as far as they're concerned, you were born in America, you took advantage of some form of American services and infrastructure, and therefore you owe them in perpetuity, except they take money instead of, drumming you into service in the US Navy. But it's effectively the same principle, what the some Royal Navy officers were doing to British citizens who had become American. And then you had the other lot, and this was particularly the Chesapeake Leopard affair, which were British sailors, or sailors in service to Britain, who had deserted, they'd gone AWOL, managed in some way, shape or form to make their way to America, where they'd applied for American citizenship, and America gone, yeah, sure, whatever, have a citizenship. We don't have too many people, we always need of a few more. And then, as far as the Americans were concerned, these people were now American. They had their citizenship, etc., etc. All was fine and well with the world. As far as the British were concerned, they were a bunch of traitors and deserters who were hiding behind a fig leaf of being of another nationality, and they were kind of going, yeah, well, pull the other one, mate, it's got bells on it, you're still coming back onto our ship. And this is where the biggest clashes went, because obviously those were the people who tended to be the most violent in terms of resisting, because they didn't really like the prospects of what was going to happen to them when they were all kicking and screaming for desertion back onto a British warship. So, take across that entire gamut. Going back, I guess, to the original question, how likely is it for a British warship to pull up next to your merchant ship and impress at least some of your crew? It happened. It happened enough to spark a war, amongst other reasons, for the War of 1812. So it wasn't exactly uncommon, but as for how likely you were as a particular individual to be impressed into British naval service, that would depend an awful lot on where your more recent origins actually were. If you were, say, especially by the time of 1805 to 1812, you might well have been born in the continental United States when it is the United States, and so you have always been an American citizen.
it's relatively unlikely that the British are going to mess with you. If, on the other hand, your family moved across to America when you were 14, 15, and this is your first job, you've just recently signed up on a ship, maybe 16, 17, 18, yeah, you may very well end up being pressed into British service. And if you were a sailor in His Majesty's Navy until a couple of months ago, and you've handily got your US citizen papers because you don't like that, but a British warship has caught up with you, well, they're probably caught up with that ship specifically to hunt you down, so at which point, yes, you definitely are ending up in Royal Navy service again. Classe Cornate asks, you've talked about the modern maximum viable gun size being about 18 to 20 inches, but what about the ironclad era? Were the 100-ton guns the maximum viable size? Gun-wise, I suspect they probably could have gone a little bit larger, because obviously these weapons are much, much shorter. Okay, they're also much more massively built up around the breach area, but they could be made considerably larger. I mean, there were 20-inch Dahlgrens under construction at the end of the American Civil War. So, 10, 15 years later, when the 17.72 100-ton gun is coming in, well, surely at that point, yeah, you could make an argument that a much larger weapon, perhaps a 20 or a 24-inch gun, could have been made. And I can see it being made at some point. Part of the reason why the 18 to 20-inch caliber is kind of the upper level of sanity in more modern warships is that you have rate of fire issues. Your rate of fire is going to drop off significantly below that of your opponent, which means an opponent with 16 or 18-inch guns is going to have a significant advantage over you. But the reloading times during the ironclad era, when you got up to 14, 15, 16, 17, 18-inch guns, are so absurdly long anyway that if it takes you 6 minutes to reload and it takes your opponent 5 minutes to reload, no one really cares. You're basically getting off one salvo before you're going to be in point-blank ramming range anyway, or you're going to both respectfully stand off at distance and wait for each other to reload or something like that. The single biggest limitation, I think, on gun size in the ironclad era is less whether or not they could build the gun, less not even the rate of fire, more the fact of whether they could build the ship big enough to support the gun. Because remember, Inflexible couldn't mount the 100-ton gun, which is why the 100-ton guns ended up being installed in Malta and Gibraltar, just in case the Italians, who had just about managed to build a ship that could carry the 100-ton gun, decided to come out and play. But when you look at that, Sansbury and Victoria with their 16.25s, Benbow of the time also mounting a pair of 16.25s but in a slightly different configuration, the ironclad battleships weren't that large, and even with short barrel weapons you were approaching the limits of what you could actually fit. So maybe you could get a single 20-inch gun mounted forward, but you'd be struggling at that point. So whilst you could probably physically build a 24-inch black powder gun in that time period, you'd struggle to find a ship you could actually fit it to. So weirdly enough, the 18 to 20-inch caliber actually kind of remains the practical limit in the ironclad period, but not for any of the reasons that it is in the more modern period. It's simply because you wouldn't find anything that could carry a bigger gun, at least not easily, unless you brought Great Eastern into naval service, at which point, yeah, sure, fit it with like 4 24-inch guns and watch everybody get very confused. And, well, that's the end of part 1. It looks like I have run out of time, so time to hit the render button, and part 2 will be released next week. Well, that's what happens when jet lag wipes you out for 3 days, but, oh well, thanks very much for listening to this half of the Patreon recorded Drydock section, and hope to see you again in another video.